Hey, so real quick, name a European ethnic group, go ahead. French, Germans, Spanish, maybe Hungarians. Cool. Now here's the wild part. The single largest ethnic minority on the entire continent? Most people can't even name them. We're talking 10 to 12 million people spread from Ireland to Siberia, from Spain to Brazil, and for most of recorded history they simply didn't exist on any official map. No country, no army, no flag, just people, everywhere, and somehow still here. Tonight we're talking about the Roma, and no, not the city in Italy. Wrong spelling, different vibe entirely. We're talking about a people who pulled off something historians still struggle to explain, surviving for over 1,000 years without a homeland, holding on to a shared identity through empires, expulsions, and centuries of being told they don't belong anywhere. That's not a sob story. That's honestly one of the most remarkable feats in all of human history, and almost nobody talks about it. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching this from? Seriously, I want to know, because this story touches almost every corner of the planet, and chances are, wherever you are, the Roma were there too. Let's get into it. For most of European history, nobody had any real idea where the Roma came from, and to be fair, this wasn't entirely laziness on the part of historians. The Roma themselves didn't exactly hand out pamphlets explaining their origins. They arrived in waves, spoke a language nobody recognized, practiced customs that looked foreign to everyone around them, and seemed to materialize out of the eastern horizon like they'd simply always been traveling. So naturally, Europeans did what people tend to do when faced with something they don't understand. They made things up. The theories were, charitably speaking, creative. Some scholars in the 15th century were absolutely convinced the Roma were descendants of the ancient Egyptians, which is where the word gypsy actually comes from, a corrupted shorthand for Egyptian. This sounded plausible enough at the time, mostly because Egypt had a reputation for mystery, and the Roma seemed mysterious, which is more or less the intellectual standard of the era. Others proposed they were refugees from a sunken continent, or the lost tribes of Israel, or wandering penitents condemned by God to roam the earth. One particularly ambitious theory held that they were descendants of the biblical Cain. Nobody stopped to ask how Cain's descendants ended up speaking something that sounded vaguely like Persian with Sanskrit undertones, but details were apparently optional. The Egyptian theory was so persistent that Roma communities in several countries actually leaned into it strategically. If people were going to assume you came from somewhere exotic and ancient, it was occasionally useful to confirm those suspicions rather than correct them. So Roma leaders in 15th century Western Europe sometimes presented themselves to local authorities as pilgrims from Little Egypt, a term that may have referred to a region in Greece or the Peloponnese, not Africa, and this served as a kind of travel document, a reason to be tolerated in places that were increasingly hostile to wandering strangers. It was clever, it was pragmatic, and it was completely untrue. The actual truth turned out to be far more interesting, and it came not from old chronicles or legends, but from a young Hungarian student sitting in a dormitory in the late 18th century who noticed something that nobody, in centuries of speculation, had bothered to notice before. His name was István Valley, and around 1763 he was studying in Leiden alongside students from the Malabar coast of India. One afternoon, purely by chance, he overheard them talking, and something in their words stopped him cold. The sounds were familiar. The patterns were familiar. Not identical to anything he'd heard, but recognizable in the way that a melody is recognizable even when played in a different key. Valley was from Hungary and had grown up around Roma communities. He had, without formally studying it, absorbed enough of the Romani language to notice that the words these Indian students were using bore a striking resemblance to words he'd heard Roma people use all his life. He started writing things down. He compiled a vocabulary list, asked the Indian students to translate words into their language, and compared them systematically to Romani. The overlaps were not coincidental. Words for everyday objects, family relationships, numbers, body parts. They matched with a consistency that pointed to a shared origin, not a random borrowing. Valley published his observations, and the academic world, to its credit, took them seriously. Within a few decades, European philologists were digging into the Romani language with genuine scholarly rigour, and what they found rewrote everything. The language spoken by Roma communities across Europe, Romani in its many dialects, is not a made-up secret code, not a pidgin assembled from borrowed scraps, and definitely not Egyptian. It is an Indo-Aryan language. That places it in the same broad family as Hindi, Punjabi, Gujarati, Marathi, and, critically, Sanskrit, the ancient classical language of the Indian subcontinent that sits at the root of the entire Indo-Aryan branch like a very old and very well-organized grandmother who insisted everyone speak properly. The structural evidence is overwhelming. Romani grammar follows patterns that are distinctly South Asian: verb conjugations, noun declensions, the way sentences are built. The phonology, meaning the sounds the language uses and how they combine, is Indian in character in ways that would be essentially impossible to fake or accidentally import. And the vocabulary is where the connection becomes almost startling in its clarity. Take the word for brother. In Romani it is frawl. In Sanskrit the word is bratri, and in Hindi it evolved into bhai. The relationship is direct and traceable through standard rules of sound change. The word for hand is vast in Romani, from Sanskrit hasta. The word for ear is kan, from Sanskrit karna, which is also where the name of the great warrior Karna in the Mahabharata comes from, if you want a memorable anchor point. The word for black is kalo in Romani, from Sanskrit kala, the same root that gives us the name of the goddess Kali. The word for horse is grast, traceable to Sanskrit gotaka. The word for water is pani, and if you've ever learned even a handful of Hindi words, you will recognize pani immediately, because it hasn't changed. These are not borrowed words. Languages borrow words all the time. English borrowed enormous quantities from French, Latin, Greek, Arabic, and about 40 other sources, and nobody claims English originated in France. Borrowed vocabulary sits on top of a language's core structure without changing it. What we see in Romani is different. The core vocabulary is the words that never get borrowed because they're too fundamental to daily life. Words for body parts, basic actions, family relationships, numbers, is Indian. That means the people who first spoke Romani were not Europeans who picked up some Indian words along the way. They were Indian speakers whose language then absorbed layers of Persian, Greek, Romanian, Turkish, German, Spanish, and whatever else they encountered over centuries of travel. The linguistic work of the 18th and 19th centuries established the Indian origin of the Roma firmly enough that it became scholarly consensus. But consensus among philologists and consensus among the general public are, famously, not the same thing, and the Egyptian theory lingered in popular imagination for a very long time. What finally drove a stake through it, to use a metaphor the Roma might find darkly ironic given the vampire legends some of their communities became associated with, was genetics. Modern genetic analysis, which became sophisticated enough to trace population histories in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, confirmed what the linguists had been saying for 200 years. And then it got more specific. Studies examining the Y chromosome, which passes from father to son with minimal change over generations, and can therefore trace paternal lineages across enormous stretches of time, found that Roma men carry genetic markers characteristic of populations from northwestern India. The haplogroup H1A1A, to use the technical designation, is found at high frequencies in populations from Rajasthan and Punjab. It is rare in the Middle East and essentially absent in Egypt. If the Roma had come from Egypt, the Y chromosome evidence would look completely different. It doesn't. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, which traces maternal lineages, told a similar story. Roma women carry mitochondrial markers that cluster with South Asian populations, particularly those from the northwestern part of the subcontinent. The maternal line points to the same general region as the paternal line, which means this isn't a case of, say, a group of Indian men who married local women as they travelled west, and gradually became something else. The founding population that eventually became the Roma was substantially Indian on both sides. A landmark study published in 2012 in the journal Current Biology analysed the genomes of over 13 groups of Roma from across Europe and compared them to potential source populations. The results were precise enough to narrow the origin not just to India generally, but to northwestern India specifically, and to estimate that the founding population that left India numbered somewhere between a few hundred and a few thousand individuals. A small group by population genetics standards, which explains why Roma today share certain genetic markers at higher frequencies than you'd expect in a larger, more diverse founding group. This genetic bottleneck, the term for when a population is descended from a small founding group, has practical consequences beyond historical interest. It means that certain genetic conditions are more common in Roma populations than in the general European population, because if one of those few hundred founders happened to carry a particular genetic variant, that variant got passed down to a disproportionately large number of descendants. Researchers studying Roma health outcomes have identified elevated rates of certain hereditary conditions, and understanding the genetic history is directly relevant to medical care, which gives this academic-sounding DNA research some very real-world stakes. What the genetics also showed, and what added an important layer to the linguistic picture, was evidence of the journey itself. Roma DNA doesn't jump straight from India to Europe. Along the way, there are clear traces of admixture, genetic mixing, with populations from Persia, the Armenian highlands, and Anatolia. The Roma didn't teleport from Rajasthan to Romania. They travelled for centuries, stopping, settling temporarily, intermarrying to some degree with local populations, and then moving on. The genetic record is essentially a map of the route, with timestamps, and this is where the linguistic evidence and the genetic evidence converge in a particularly satisfying way. Because the Romani language didn't just carry Indian vocabulary into Europe, it also accumulated layers of borrowing that correspond precisely to the regions the genetics indicate the Roma passed through. There are Persian loanwords in Romani, words for concepts and objects that Roma presumably encountered during the centuries their ancestors spent in what is now Iran. There are Armenian loanwords. There are Greek loanwords that entered the language during the period when Roma communities were living in or passing through Byzantine territory. And then, once Roma reached Western and Central Europe, the dialects began to diverge, each absorbing vocabulary from the local dominant language, Romanian in Romania, Turkish in Turkey, Spanish in Spain, German in the German-speaking lands. The result is a language that functions almost like a geological core sample. If you drill down through the layers of a Romani dialect, you find recent local vocabulary near the surface, then older Greek and Balkan borrowings below that, then Persian and Armenian elements deeper down, and at the very bottom, the Indian bedrock that was there from the beginning. Linguists can actually use this layering to reconstruct the approximate order of regions the Roma passed through, because you can tell roughly when a word entered the language based on how it changed over time, and which other languages it travelled alongside. Now, the obvious question, the one that follows logically from everything the DNA and the linguistics tell us, is why? Why did a group of people leave northwestern India, and why did they keep moving? The answer is not simple, and it is not a single answer, because the Roma did not leave India in one dramatic exodus. The departure was more like a slow leak than a burst pipe, a series of migrations over several centuries rather than a single moment of departure. But the conditions that made migration likely, and in some cases necessary, were very much present in northwestern India during the period in question. Before getting into that, though, it is worth pausing on what the scientific evidence has actually accomplished, beyond settling the academic question of origins. For most of European history, Roma people were defined by outsiders in ways that stripped them of a coherent history. They were Egyptian, or they were biblical wanderers, or they were simply mysterious, which is a polite way of saying their actual past was considered irrelevant. The scientific work of the last 2.5 centuries, starting with a Hungarian student overhearing a conversation in a Leiden dormitory, and ending with genome-wide association studies and mitochondrial haplogroup analysis, gave the Roma back a history that had always been theirs. They came from India, specifically most likely from the northwestern regions of what is now Rajasthan and Punjab. They spoke an Indo-Aryan language that was a relative of Sanskrit, and that language carried within it, perfectly preserved like insects in amber, the vocabulary of a life lived on the subcontinent thousands of years ago. The word for water is still pani, the word for hand is still vast, the word for brother is still fral, a ghost of the Sanskrit pratri, preserved across 10 centuries and 1,500 miles, and every empire and persecution in between. That persistence, it turns out, is not an accident. It is not stubbornness for its own sake. It is what a language does when the people who speak it have decided, consciously or not, that the language is the homeland. When you carry no territory with you, you carry vocabulary instead. The grammar becomes the map, and the words become the border of a country that travels wherever you travel and cannot be taken from you by any king, any government, or any cartographer who insists on drawing boundaries where you happen to be standing. The science confirmed what the Roma had always known in some intuitive sense. They were from somewhere specific, their culture was connected to something ancient and coherent, and their presence in Europe was not an aberration or an accident. They were the descendants of a migration that crossed half the known world, carrying a language and a set of practices that survived everything the journey threw at them. What the science cannot fully explain, what no genetic study or linguistic analysis can capture, is the texture of daily life during that journey. The decisions made by people whose names we will never know, in circumstances we can only partly reconstruct. Why did they leave? What were they running from, or moving toward? What did they find when they arrived in Persia, in Armenia, in Anatolia, in Greece? What made some of them stay for generations while others kept moving? For those answers, we have to go back to India, to the centuries before the migration began, and look at the world those first travellers were leaving behind. And that world was, to put it mildly, complicated. Northwestern India in the first millennium of the Common Era was a place of extraordinary cultural richness, and, simultaneously, a society structured in ways that made life for certain groups of people genuinely difficult in ways that are worth understanding. The caste system, which is a term that slightly flattens a complex reality, but serves as a useful shorthand, organised society into hereditary occupational groups with very different levels of status, resources and freedom. At the top were the Brahmins, the priestly and scholarly class. Below them were the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers, then the Vaishyas, merchants and farmers, then the Shudras, artisans and labourers, and then, outside and below the formal caste hierarchy, the groups that performed work considered ritually impure, work with leather, with death, with iron, with music and entertainment in certain contexts. The genetic and linguistic evidence suggests that the ancestors of the Roma came substantially from artisan communities, groups whose hereditary occupations involved metalworking, music, trade and crafts. These were people who were mobile by necessity, because their services were needed across a wide area and because their social position made permanent, stable settlement in any one community difficult. They were useful, but not entirely welcome. They provided essential services, but not on entirely equal terms. They occupied a social space that was economically necessary and socially marginal at the same time, which is a combination that tends to produce people who are very good at navigating complicated situations and not particularly attached to any single place. This is speculative, but the speculation is grounded. The Romani language's core vocabulary includes a notable concentration of words related to metalworking, music, trade, and movement. The skills that Roma communities historically practiced across Europe, blacksmithing, horse trading, music, fortune-telling, craft work, are precisely the skills associated with mobile artisan communities in South Asian contexts. The connection is not coincidental. And then, beginning in the late 10th century, the conditions in northwestern India changed significantly and rather violently. The Ghaznavid raids, military incursions from what is now Afghanistan, led by the Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, beginning around 1001 of the Common Era, swept through Punjab and Rajasthan repeatedly over the following decades. Mahmud conducted 17 major campaigns into the Indian subcontinent, and while the primary targets were wealthy temples and city centres, the disruption to civilian populations was enormous. People were displaced, communities were destroyed, and the social fabric of the region was torn in ways that made staying considerably less appealing than it had been before. The raids did not cause a single great exodus, but they accelerated a process that was already underway, the gradual westward movement of groups who had reasons, economic and social, to seek opportunities elsewhere. Some of these groups likely ended up in Persia, where Persian chronicles from the 10th and 11th centuries mention groups of travelling musicians and craftspeople arriving from the east. Some continued further west, and over the following centuries the groups that would eventually become the Roma made their way, generation by generation, through the landscapes that the genetics and linguistics would later record in their respective ways. It is worth noting that this was not at any point a unified migration with a clear leadership and a shared destination. There was no Roma Moses standing at the border of India saying, right, everyone into the desert, we're going to Europe. The movement was fragmented, occurring over hundreds of years, with different groups taking different routes and arriving in different regions at different times. The unity of the Roma people, the shared language, the shared customs, the shared sense of identity, developed gradually, as these dispersed groups maintained enough contact with each other to reinforce a common culture even while adapting to wildly different local circumstances. The language is the clearest evidence of this. The fact that Romani dialects, despite centuries of separation, and geographic dispersal across an entire continent, still share a recognizable core, still use pani for water, still use vast for hand, still preserve the grammatical structures that connect them to Sanskrit, means that contact was maintained, or at least that the core identity was reinforced strongly enough that even isolated communities didn't drift entirely away from the shared base. Language doesn't preserve itself. People preserve it by choosing to speak it, by teaching it to children, by using it as a marker of belonging that distinguishes the community from the surrounding world. And that, in the end, is perhaps the most remarkable thing the linguistic and genetic evidence reveals. Not just that the Roma came from India, not just that they travelled across half the world, but that across all that distance and all those centuries, they held on to the thing that connected them to where they'd started. Every time a Roma parent taught a child the Romani word for brother rather than the local word, every time a community chose to speak their own language among themselves, even while learning the language of the country they were passing through, they were performing an act of cultural preservation that no state apparatus, no church authority, and no political force was organising or enforcing. They did it themselves, in the margins of every society they passed through, carrying a language that was also a memory, and a memory that was also an origin story, and an origin story that modern science, with its genome-wide analyses and its haplogroup mappings and its comparative linguistic databases, eventually confirmed was exactly true. The Roma came from India. The evidence is in the words and in the blood, and both tell the same story, which is the oldest kind of confirmation there is. To appreciate just how significant the linguistic survival is, it helps to compare the Romani case to other diaspora languages in history. Many migrant communities, when transplanted into foreign environments and subjected to sustained social pressure, gradually lose their original languages within 3 to 4 generations. Historians have documented this pattern repeatedly. Communities arrive speaking one language, their children become bilingual, their grandchildren understand the heritage language but prefer the local one, and by the 4th generation the original language is essentially gone, except in ceremonial contexts and among elderly speakers. This is not a failure of will. It is what happens when a language lacks institutional support, no schools teaching it, no government using it, no church conducting services in it, no media broadcasting in it. Romani had none of those supports. In almost every country where Roma communities settled or passed through, the dominant society actively discouraged or outright suppressed Romani. In some periods and places, speaking Romani in public was literally illegal. Authorities in various European countries at various times issued edicts requiring Roma to abandon their language and speak the local tongue instead, as part of broader assimilation policies that range from optimistic to coercive to something considerably worse. The logic, such as it was, held that if Roma could be made to stop speaking Romani, they would gradually cease to be Roma and would dissolve into the surrounding population, which would solve the problem of their existence in a way that was neater, if not gentler, than the alternatives some authorities were considering. It did not work. Romani survived. Not intact. The language today is not the same as it was in India 1,000 years ago, and it was never meant to be. Languages are not museum exhibits. They change, they adapt, they absorb. What survived was the core, the grammar, the fundamental vocabulary, the structural logic of the language that marks it unmistakably as Indo-Aryan rather than European. That survival is a testament to something that is difficult to quantify and easy to underestimate, which is the sheer stubbornness of a community that decided this was worth keeping. The dialects of Romani today are numerous and vary considerably. A Roma person from Finland and a Roma person from southern Spain would not be immediately intelligible to each other, just as a Norwegian and an Italian are not immediately intelligible to each other, despite both being European. But the underlying structure is recognisably shared, and speakers who make the effort can generally find common ground in the core vocabulary. Linguists recognise several main dialect clusters. Vlax Romani, spoken largely by Roma communities associated with the formerly enslaved populations of Romania and Moldova, is the most widely distributed and has served in some contexts as a kind of lingua franca among Roma communities. Balkan Romani covers communities across the southeastern Balkans. Sinti Romani is spoken by the Sinti communities of Central Europe, and Romani varieties in Western Europe, including Calo in Spain and Anglo-Romani in Britain, represent the most heavily mixed dialects, where centuries of contact with local languages have resulted in what linguists call mixed languages, where the grammar is largely local, but the vocabulary retains strong Romani elements. Each of these dialects carries its own history within it. Vlax Romani, for instance, has absorbed enormous quantities of Romanian vocabulary, which is itself a Latin-derived language, which means Vlax Romani contains words that trace a journey from Sanskrit through whatever intermediate stages preceded Romanian contact, and then absorbed Latin-rooted words during the centuries when Roma communities were present in the Romanian principalities. The language is, in a very literal sense, a record of everywhere it has been. The Greek loanwords in Romani deserve particular attention because they are so numerous and so deeply integrated that they point to a significant period of settlement or close contact with Greek-speaking populations. Words like drom, meaning road or way, from Greek dromos; phoros, meaning town, from Greek polis or its derivatives; zoli, meaning bile or anger, from Greek. The sheer quantity of Greek borrowings in the core Romani vocabulary, not peripheral specialized vocabulary, but words for everyday concepts, suggests that Roma communities spent a substantial amount of time in Greek-speaking territory, possibly for several generations before moving further into Europe. This is consistent with the historical record showing Roma communities documented in the Byzantine Empire in the 11th and 12th centuries, and with the genetic evidence showing admixture with populations from that region. The Persian loanwords tell a similar story about an earlier period. Words like bakst, meaning luck or fortune, from Persian; vast, meaning hand, has Persian cognates as well as the Sanskrit root; zor, meaning strength or power, from Persian zor; diz, meaning fortress, from Persian. These borrowings are older, more phonologically integrated into Romani, which suggests they entered the language during a period when the ancestors of the Roma were in Persian-speaking territory, long enough for these words to become core vocabulary, rather than recent additions. If you wanted to date the Iranian period of Roma prehistory by looking at the language alone, the pattern of borrowing suggests it was not a brief transit but an extended stay, decades or generations, not weeks. Armenian loanwords are fewer but present, and they appear to represent yet another layer of the journey. The presence of Armenian vocabulary specifically, rather than just Caucasian vocabulary generally, points to contact with Armenian-speaking communities rather than simply passing through Armenian territory. This suggests some degree of integration, or at least sustained interaction with Armenian populations during what historical linguists generally date to somewhere between the 9th and 11th centuries. All of this reconstruction from vocabulary is, of course, interpretation rather than certainty. Languages don't come with timestamps. But the convergence of multiple lines of evidence, the genetic admixture data, the linguistic borrowing patterns, the documentary records from Byzantine, Arab and Persian sources, paints a picture consistent enough to have achieved broad scholarly consensus. The Roma entered the Middle East from India, moved through Persia and the Caucasus region, spent time in Byzantine Greek-speaking territory, and then gradually dispersed into the various regions of Europe from the 13th century onward. The 2012 current biology study mentioned earlier was followed by additional genetic research that refined the picture further. A 2015 study published in the European Journal of Human Genetics looked specifically at the timing of the migration from India, using statistical methods to estimate when the founding population left the subcontinent, based on the patterns of genetic drift and admixture visible in modern Roma populations. The estimates converged on a departure date roughly between the 6th and 11th centuries of the Common Era, consistent with the linguistic and historical evidence, and consistent with the period when the conditions in northwestern India were becoming increasingly difficult for the kinds of communities that the genetic and linguistic evidence suggests the Roma ancestors belonged to. Subsequent research has also illuminated something important about the structure of the founding population. It was not homogeneous. The genetic evidence suggests the founding group included people from more than one caste background, more than one occupational tradition, and possibly more than one region of northwestern India. The Roma are not descended from a single community that left en masse. They are descended from a collection of communities that, over the course of the journey westward, merged into a new collective identity. The shared language, which must have involved some degree of mutual intelligibility and convergence to function as a common tongue, was one of the key mechanisms by which this merger happened. This has an interesting implication. The Roma identity is not simply a transported Indian identity, it is a new identity that was forged in the process of migration, out of materials that were originally Indian but that were reshaped by the experience of the journey itself. The language that emerged from that process is not exactly any one Indian language from the 10th century. It is something new that was made possible by the migration and would not have existed without it. In a very real sense. The Roma people were created by the road, not merely displaced onto it. This framing matters because it changes how we understand the persistence of Roma identity across centuries and continents. It was not simply a matter of stubbornly maintaining something old. It was a matter of continuously remaking something that had been new to begin with, adapting it to new circumstances while keeping the core recognizable to those who shared it. The language changed, the culture absorbed new elements, the community evolved, but the thread connecting contemporary Roma in Madrid to contemporary Rome in Budapest to the ancestors who left India 1,000 years ago did not break. Modern genetics has also done something that earlier scholarship could not. It has given individual faces, in a sense, to the statistical patterns. Population geneticists studying Roma communities have been able to identify specific genetic markers that were almost certainly present in the founding population. Markers rare enough in Indian populations generally, and common enough in Roma populations specifically, that they must have been carried by one of the original migrants and then passed down to large numbers of descendants. When a researcher identifies such a marker in a Roma person in Slovakia today, they are, in a very precise sense, identifying a piece of biological inheritance that has been passed from parent to child continuously for perhaps 1,000 years, surviving every displacement and persecution and migration in between. That continuity of transmission, biological, linguistic, cultural, is the real subject of this chapter, and it is worth being explicit about what it demonstrates. It demonstrates that identity does not require territory. It does not require a state, a flag, an army, or a recognized place on a map. It requires people who choose to transmit it, generation after generation, in the face of whatever circumstances they happen to be living through. The Roma did not have the luxury of institutions that preserve culture automatically. They had to preserve it actively, personally, domestically, in the way parents spoke to children, in the way communities marked births and deaths, in the way stories were told and songs were sung and crafts were taught. The science tells us where the Roma came from. It tells us approximately when they left, and approximately what route they took, and approximately how many of them there were when the journey began. It does not tell us the names of the people who made those decisions, or what they thought about on the road, or whether they knew they were making history. They almost certainly did not. They were doing what people do, moving toward better circumstances, maintaining the bonds that gave their lives meaning, teaching their children the things they knew. That they were also, in doing so, creating one of the most remarkable stories of cultural survival in human history was probably not on their minds at the time. It rarely is. The science established where the Roma came from. The harder question, the one that genetics and comparative linguistics cannot fully answer on their own, is why anyone left in the first place. India in the first millennium of the Common Era was not a wasteland. Northwestern India in particular, the region around what is now Rajasthan and Punjab, was agriculturally productive, culturally sophisticated, and home to some of the most elaborately organized societies on earth. People do not generally abandon productive homelands for the open road unless something is pushing them out, pulling them somewhere else, or both at once. In the case of the ancestors of the Roma, it was both, and the story of that departure is considerably more complicated than a single dramatic exodus. The popular imagination tends to love the idea of a great migration, a single decisive moment when a people packed their belongings, looked back one last time at the land they were leaving, and set off into the unknown. It makes for a cleaner narrative, and clean narratives are easier to remember than messy realities. The reality of the Roma departure from India was not clean. It was a series of departures, spread across several centuries, driven by different pressures at different times, involving different groups who shared some characteristics, but were not initially a unified people. The unity came later, on the road, forged by shared experience and shared language in a process that took generations. To understand why people left, you have to understand what they were leaving. And the central institution of that world, the one that shaped everything about daily life in the subcontinent, was the caste system, a structure of hereditary social organization that had been developing for centuries and that by the early medieval period had become extraordinarily elaborate, and extraordinarily rigid. The basic outline of the caste system is familiar. Society organized into hierarchical groups, membership determined by birth, occupation largely dictated by caste, and social interaction between groups regulated by complex rules of purity and pollution. What the textbook version tends to underemphasize is how total this system was in its practical effects on daily life, and how little room it left for the kind of social mobility that might have made staying worthwhile for those at its margins. Consider what daily life meant for a hereditary artisan community in 8th century Rajasthan. You woke up knowing exactly what you would do with your life, because your grandfather had done the same thing, and his grandfather before him. The work itself, smithing, leatherwork, music, carpentry, could be genuinely skilled and fulfilling, but the social rewards for that skill were carefully calibrated to remain just short of actual equality. A Brahmin scholar who could recite the entire Rig Veda from memory occupied a social position that no amount of metalworking excellence could approach. The best smith in the region still ate separately from the landowning farmers whose tools he made still lived in the designated section of the village, still navigated the daily logistics of a society that needed his labour, and simultaneously insisted on maintaining a visible distance. Your caste did not just determine what job you could do. It determined where you could live, who you could eat with, who you could marry, what rituals you were permitted to perform, where you could draw water, what parts of a village you were allowed to enter. It determined, in an almost absolute sense, what kind of human being the society around you considered you to be. At the top of this hierarchy sat the Brahmin scholarly and priestly class, whose purity had to be maintained at significant cost to everyone else. At the bottom, technically outside the formal Varna structure entirely, were the communities that performed work the upper castes considered ritually polluting, work involving death, bodily substances, animal skins, and certain kinds of physical labour. These communities occupied a social position so marginal that even their physical proximity was considered potentially contaminating by the upper castes. Not exactly the warm, inclusive society the tourist brochures might describe. The communities that the genetic and linguistic evidence suggests were ancestral to the Roma sat in a complex middle zone, not at the very bottom of the hierarchy, but not comfortably inside the stable, landowning middle either. The occupations historically associated with Roma communities across Europe, metalworking, music and entertainment, horse trading, various crafts, correspond remarkably closely to the occupations of specific artisan and service castes in northwestern India. Metalworkers in particular occupied an ambiguous position. Their skills were essential, iron and copper tools being rather fundamental to agricultural civilization, but their work with fire and metal was associated with qualities that the Brahminical worldview found difficult to classify neatly. Musicians and entertainers occupied a similarly complicated position. Music was sacred in the highest possible sense in classical Indian culture. The Vedas were sung, not spoken, and the theory of music was considered a branch of divine knowledge. At the same time, professional musicians who performed for public audiences, particularly those associated with courts and with celebrations rather than strictly religious contexts, occupied a social niche that was valuable but not entirely respectable. They were welcomed at the feast but not at the family table, which is a position that tends to produce people who are very good at reading rooms and very experienced at depending on their skills rather than on social stability. What the caste system created, in practical terms, was a population of highly skilled artisans and specialists who were simultaneously essential to the functioning of the broader society and fundamentally excluded from its benefits. They could not own land in any stable, heritable sense. They could not accumulate the kind of generational wealth that comes from property. Their position in any community was contingent on the community's continued need for their particular skills, and when that need shifted, as it did when armies came through, when towns were destroyed, when trade routes changed, they had very little anchoring them to any specific place. They were mobile by economic necessity long before they became mobile by historical circumstance. This structural mobility is important to understand because it means the ancestors of the Roma were not simply passive victims of displacement. They were already practicing a way of life that was adapted to movement, to changing circumstances, to building relationships with different communities based on the exchange of skills and services. When conditions in northwestern India became actively hostile rather than merely difficult, the transition from seasonal or regional mobility to longer distance migration was not a total rupture. It was an intensification of something that was already there, and conditions in northwestern India did become actively hostile, beginning in a serious and sustained way in the late 10th century. The Ghaznavid Empire, centered in what is now eastern Afghanistan, was one of the major powers of the Islamic world in this period, and its most famous ruler, Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, had a particular interest in the extraordinarily wealthy temples and trading cities of the Indian subcontinent. Between 1001 and 1027 of the Common Era, Mahmud led 17 major military campaigns across the Hindu Kush and into the plains of Punjab and Rajasthan. Some historians frame these raids primarily as religious campaigns against polytheistic Hindu society, and Mahmud's court poets were certainly enthusiastic in framing them that way. The actual motivation was considerably more straightforward. The temples of northwestern India were, by the standards of the medieval world, staggeringly wealthy, and Mahmud needed money to fund his empire and pay his armies, which was the kind of practical consideration that tends to override theological niceties. The temple at Somnath alone, sacked in 1025, reportedly yielded treasures that took multiple camel caravans to transport back to Ghazna. Whether this was an act of religious zeal or an extremely effective fundraising campaign is a question historians are still debating with some enthusiasm. The distinction probably mattered less to the people living in the affected communities than to the scholars analysing them 1,000 years later. The raids were systematic and devastating. Major cities were sacked, temples were stripped of their treasuries, and large numbers of people were taken as captives and brought back to the Ghaznavid capital. The chronicles record tens of thousands of prisoners taken in individual campaigns. These captives included soldiers, craftsmen, skilled workers of various kinds, precisely the kind of people whose skills made them valuable, rather than simply burdensome to a conqueror. An army that needs swords and tools has obvious uses for smiths. A court that wants to demonstrate its cultural refinement has obvious uses for musicians and entertainers. This is where the migration story intersects, in a particularly vivid way, with a much older legend. A legend that turns out to be remarkably close to a documented historical reality. The legend concerns a Persian king known as Bahram-Gir, who ruled the Sassanid Empire in the early 5th century of the Common Era. The story, preserved in several Persian literary sources including the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi and the works of the poet Nizami, holds that Bahram, troubled by the fact that his poor subjects could not afford music being, in the Iranian court tradition, an essential component of civilized life, sent an ambassador to the King of India with a request for musicians. The Indian king obliged and sent 10,000 Luri musicians, the word Luri being a term used in Persian sources for travelling musicians and craftspeople of apparent Indian origin, along with their instruments, their cattle, and enough grain to sustain them while they learned to make their living by playing for the Persian people. The king's instructions to the Luri were essentially go among the people, play music, accept grain as payment, and feed yourselves and your animals from what you earn. The Luri, who had perhaps not spent much time thinking through the economics of this arrangement, ate the grain in the first year rather than planting it, failed to accumulate any reserves, and found themselves unable to sustain the arrangement the king had envisioned. Bahram, understandably unimpressed, sent them back on the road with instructions to travel and earn their living through music, which is more or less what they did, and which the legend presents as the origin of the travelling musician tradition. Now, the obvious thing to say about a legend in which a king sends 10,000 musicians across international borders is that this is almost certainly not a literally accurate historical account. Kings in medieval literature tend to do things in round numbers and on implausibly grand scales, and the logistics of resettling 10,000 people complete with cattle are, shall we say, challenging. But the legend is interesting not for its literal truth, but for what it reveals about cultural memory. Persian literary tradition, writing centuries after the fact, remembered the presence of Indian musicians in Iran, and understood that presence as a result of deliberate royal action connecting the two regions. The Luri of the Persian sources are widely considered by scholars to be one of the groups ancestral to the Roma, and similar traditions exist in other cultures describing the arrival of Indian musicians and craftspeople from the East. The legend may be compressing and mythologizing a process that actually unfolded over much longer timeframes and through much more mundane mechanisms. People move for economic opportunity. Skilled workers go where their skills are valued. A court that wants good music will attract musicians. A trade network that connects Iran to India will carry people as well as goods. These processes don't require a single royal command. They just require the conditions that make movement rational. And for artisan communities in northwestern India during the period of Ghaznavid expansion, movement westward was becoming increasingly rational. The Ghaznavid raids represent a more dramatic and documentable mechanism of displacement. When Mahmud's forces swept through Punjab, they did not leave behind stable communities whose members could simply return to their former lives. Some did, of course. Populations are resilient, and most people, given a choice, prefer to stay where they know the terrain, the language, and the people. But for the kinds of communities that were already marginally positioned within the social hierarchy, already practiced in mobility, already economically dependent on skills that could be exercised anywhere rather than on land that could only be worked in one place, the combination of Ghaznavid disruption and the chronic pressures of the caste system created conditions in which continuing westward, toward regions that might offer better opportunities, or at least fewer immediate threats, was a reasonable choice. The migration was not a single wave, but a series of them. Some groups left earlier, driven by the structural pressures of the caste system and the economic logic of following trade routes westward. Others left later, more directly displaced by military violence. Still others may have been forcibly transported as captives, found themselves in unfamiliar territory, and built new lives there rather than attempting the long journey back. What all these groups shared, as the genetic evidence would later confirm, was their origin in the same region of northwestern India and the same general cluster of occupational and cultural traditions. By the time these groups began arriving in Persia, the Caucasus, and eventually the Byzantine Empire, they had already been travelling long enough for the first layers of non-Indian vocabulary to begin accumulating in their speech. The journey from India to Europe took not months or years but generations, and the language changed with every generation. The centuries the ancestors of the Roma spent in the lands between India and Europe are the least well-documented part of their history, which is somewhat ironic given that this is exactly the period when their distinctive identity as a people was taking shape. The documentary record from India tells us something about who they were before they left. The documentary record from Byzantine and Western European sources tells us something about who they were when they arrived. The centuries in between are largely blank from the perspective of outside observers, which means reconstructing them requires the same combination of linguistic, genetic, and archaeological inference that characterized the earlier work. What the language tells us, as already described, is that the journey included significant time in Persian-speaking territory, in Armenian-speaking territory, and in Greek-speaking territory. Each of these regions left its mark in the vocabulary, and the depth of integration of these loanwords allows linguists to estimate roughly the duration of contact. Persian loanwords are so numerous and so phonologically integrated that they suggest generations of contact, not a transit. Greek loanwords are similarly deep. What the historical record occasionally offers are glimpses, references to groups of people in Arab, Persian, and Byzantine sources that appear, based on their description, to be the same communities the linguistics and genetics are pointing toward. Arab geographers and historians of the 9th and 10th centuries mention groups they call Zot, living in the Mesopotamian lowlands, the fertile agricultural and pastoral land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq. The Zot are described in these sources as people of apparent Indian or Eastern origin, who had settled in the region, practiced particular occupations including animal husbandry and agriculture, and maintained a distinct identity from the surrounding Arab population. The Abbasid Caliphate, which governed this region, had a complicated relationship with them. The Zot were useful, they contributed to the agricultural productivity of the region and paid taxes, but they were also considered unreliable, prone to maintaining their own customs and allegiances, and resistant to the kind of assimilation the Caliphate generally preferred. This tension came to a head in a series of events that unfolded over several decades in the 9th century. The Zot communities in the Mesopotamian lowlands had developed a degree of economic independence and local political organization that made them, from the Caliphate's perspective, problematic. In the 820s, they became involved in a prolonged conflict with Abbasid authorities that modern historians sometimes describe as a rebellion, and sometimes as a series of military confrontations. The distinction depending largely on which side of the conflict you're sympathetic to. What is clear from the Arab sources is that the Zot communities were not simply passive subjects who had inexplicably decided to cause trouble. They were responding to pressures that had been building for some time, increasing taxation, competition with local Arab communities over pastoral land, and possibly the kind of accumulated resentment that comes from spending decades being simultaneously useful and unwelcome. The Zot, described in the sources as formidable fighters who use trained war elephants, which is genuinely one of the more surprising details in this entire story, and it is worth pausing to appreciate that medieval Iraq briefly contained a population fighting with war elephants, managed to hold out against Abbasid forces for a significant period before being defeated. The elephants, incidentally, were apparently brought from India along with the communities themselves, which tells you something about the scale of the original migration and the degree to which these communities maintained connections with their South Asian origins even after generations in the Middle East. Maintaining a war elephant is not a trivial logistical undertaking even today. In 9th century Mesopotamia, it was a statement. The aftermath of this defeat, around 834 of the Common Era under the Caliph al-Mu'tasim, resulted in the forced resettlement of a large number of Zot communities from Mesopotamia to the Byzantine frontier, specifically to the region around Ain Zaba in what is now southern Turkey, near the border with the Byzantine Empire. This is a significant geographical data point because it places a substantial population of people of apparent Indian origin on the doorstep of Byzantine territory roughly 4 centuries before the first documented Roma appearances in Byzantine sources. Whether the Zot communities of Mesopotamia were directly ancestral to the Roma, or whether they were one of several parallel populations with shared Indian origins that eventually merged, is a question scholars have not definitively resolved. The connection is plausible but not proven. What is significant is that the documentary record confirms the presence of populations with Indian origins in the Middle East during the period when the ancestors of the Roma were making their way westward, and that at least some of these populations ended up in the precise border region where the Roma later emerged into documented history. The 9th century, which is when the Mesopotamian Zot story unfolds, is also the period from which some of the most interesting Arab literary references to Indian origin travelling communities survive. Arab authors of this era describe musicians, craftspeople and fortune-tellers of apparent Indian origin travelling through the Caliphate's territories, and these descriptions bear enough resemblance to later descriptions of Roma communities in Byzantium and Europe that scholars have argued for a direct connection. The occupations are the same. The social position, useful but marginal, welcomed for their services but not integrated into the surrounding society, is the same. The Indian origin, noted with varying degrees of specificity, is the same. One detail that appears in several Arab sources from this period is particularly evocative. The description of these communities as people who live in tents and move frequently, who tell fortunes, who work metal, who trade horses, and who are considered skilled in arts that mainstream society values but does not entirely trust. This description would have been equally recognizable to a Byzantine official writing 2 centuries later, or to a German chronicler writing 4 centuries after that, or to a 21st century reader who has encountered Roma communities in any contemporary European context. The specific activities, the social dynamic, the tension between useful skill and social marginality, these remained consistent across enormous spans of time and distance. That consistency is not a stereotype, or rather, it is not only a stereotype. It is the signature of a genuine cultural tradition that had developed, over the centuries of migration, into a coherent way of life adapted to the specific conditions of being an itinerant minority in societies that were simultaneously dependent on and suspicious of outsiders. The communities that would eventually become the Roma had spent centuries learning how to navigate that dynamic before they ever arrived in Europe. The formation of a unified Roma identity, the sense of being one people rather than a collection of related but separate communities, is generally understood by scholars to have been a gradual process that accelerated during the period of extended presence in Byzantine territory. The Greek-speaking world of the Byzantine Empire was, by the 11th and 12th centuries, already diverse and cosmopolitan in ways that made it relatively more hospitable to communities that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. Byzantine bureaucrats were, it must be said, considerably more interested in taxes than in ethnicity, and a community that paid its dues and provided useful services could find a degree of stability that the road alone could not offer. The Byzantine sources that first document what appear clearly to be Roma communities date from the 11th and 12th centuries. A document from the monastery of Mount Athos from the year 1000 mentions Atsinkani, a Greek term whose etymology connects it to a word meaning untouchable, or someone not to be touched. who are described as fortune tellers and trainers of animals, living near the monastery and occasionally interacting with the monks, apparently to everyone's mild mutual discomfort. The monks were not entirely sure what to make of their neighbours, and the feeling appears to have been reciprocal. Whether the untouchable reference is a direct import of caste concepts from India, a Greek descriptor of ritual purity concerns, or simply a generic term for people whose practices were considered foreign, is a matter of scholarly debate. But the description of the occupation, fortune-telling, animal handling, proximity to but not integration with a settled community is immediately recognisable. The word Atsinkani, incidentally, is the origin of several of the names that European societies would eventually give to Roma communities: Zigeuner in German, Tsigan in Russian, and several Slavic languages, Tsigane in French. All of these derive from the same Byzantine Greek root. The names travelled further than the people who inspired them, which is a reasonably apt metaphor for how Roma history has tended to work. Other cultures named Roma communities after wherever they thought they came from, hence Gypsy from Egyptian in English, Gitano in Spanish, which produced the entertaining situation of the same people being called Egyptians in some countries, and Byzantines, sort of in others, when in reality they were from neither. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Roma communities are mentioned with greater frequency in Byzantine sources, located in the Peloponnese, in Thrace, in Macedonia, and around Constantinople. They are described as smiths, as musicians, as traders of horses and small livestock, as fortune-tellers and entertainers. They are associated with particular camps and seasonal routes. The Byzantine administrative apparatus, which was nothing if not thorough in its record-keeping, noted their presence, assessed their taxable activities, and assigned them to various administrative categories with the confident arbitrariness that characterized Byzantine bureaucracy at its most creative. One 12th century source describes a community of smiths who had been granted a specific location near a Byzantine city in exchange for providing metalworking services to the military, which is a remarkably pragmatic arrangement, and suggests that the Byzantine Empire was at least occasionally willing to formalize the relationship between itinerant craftspeople and state needs in ways that were mutually beneficial. Not exactly a warm welcome, but considerably better than what was coming in Western Europe a few centuries later. It is during this Byzantine period that the Romani language absorbed its deepest layer of Greek borrowing, and it is almost certainly during this period that the many regional and clan-based groups that had been travelling separately for centuries began to coalesce into a more unified identity. The shared language, which had been maintained across the journey as a marker of community membership, now became a tool of unification across a larger population. The shared practices, the shared system of social organisation, the shared understanding of how to navigate the relationship between an itinerant community and the settled world around it, all of these, refined over centuries of travel, became the foundation of a culture that was distinctively Roma rather than simply Indian in exile. This is a crucial transition, and it is worth pausing on it. The Roma who began entering the Balkans and eventually Western Europe from the 13th century onward were not simply displaced Indians who had been wandering for a long time. They were a new people, with a new identity that had been forged in the crucible of the journey. Their language was Indian in its roots, but transformed by centuries of contact with other languages. Their practices drew on Indian traditions but had been adapted and elaborated through interaction with Persian, Armenian, Byzantine, and Anatolian cultures. Their way of life, the patterns of movement, the social organisation, the relationship between community and surrounding society, had been developed specifically to be sustainable across the enormous variety of environments and cultures they had passed through. When a Roma blacksmith arrived in Hungary or Romania or Spain in the 14th century and set up a forge on the edge of a town, offering to repair iron tools for the local farmers, he was practicing a trade that his ancestors had practiced in India 1,000 years earlier, but he was doing it within a social framework that had been refined and adapted across multiple civilizations and dozens of generations. The skills were ancient. The framework for deploying those skills in a mobile minority context was the product of an extraordinary cultural evolution that had taken place entirely on the road. The legend of Bahram Gur's musicians, with which this part of the story began, captures something true about this process, even if it gets the details wrong. The idea that Indian musicians and craftspeople moved westward into the Persian world because their skills were valued there, because there was a market for what they could offer, is consistent with what the historical record suggests about the early phases of the migration. The idea that this movement created a permanent travelling way of life rather than a settled, assimilated one is also consistent with the evidence. What the legend compresses into a single royal command was in reality a centuries-long process of migration, adaptation, and identity formation. The people who eventually emerged from that process had something that no royal decree could have created, a culture that was specifically designed for mobility, that did not require a fixed territory to function, and that had proven its resilience across conditions ranging from the courts of Persian kings to the slave markets of Mesopotamia to the borderlands of the Byzantine Empire. They had been tested by the journey in ways that most settled cultures are never tested, and they had developed, in response, a set of practices and values that were extraordinarily well suited to survival in a world that was, more often than not, organized against them. They were about to need every bit of that resilience, because what came next, in the forests and cities and courtrooms of medieval and early modern Europe, was going to make the journey look like the easy part. The route from Anatolia and the Byzantine borderlands into the European interior opened gradually over the course of the 13th and 14th centuries, a period when the Byzantine Empire itself was under severe pressure from multiple directions. Crusader states to the west, Mongol expansion from the east, and the rising Ottoman power that would eventually extinguish Byzantine rule entirely in 1453. In this climate of political instability and shifting frontiers, small communities of skilled craftspeople and traders moved with the kind of ease that chaos sometimes affords. When the major powers are busy fighting each other, the people in between occasionally find the borders are less watched than usual. Not exactly ideal conditions for long-term planning, but sufficient for continued movement. Roma communities reached the Greek islands, then the Dalmatian coast, then crossed into the Balkans and the Carpathian Basin. They moved along trade routes, following the same economic logic that had characterized the migration from the beginning. Go where the skills are needed, provide what people cannot provide for themselves, keep moving when the welcome runs out. Some communities settled more permanently in regions where conditions were favorable. Others maintained seasonal circuits, returning to the same locations at the same times of year, with sufficient regularity that local populations came to expect and plan for their arrival. This pattern, semi-nomadic circulation rather than either full settlement or random wandering, was not improvisation. It was a sophisticated economic strategy honed over centuries. When the first Roma ambassadors, as they styled themselves, appeared at the gates of Western European cities in the early 15th century, bearing letters of safe conduct and stories of a distant origin, they were the visible end of a journey that had begun in various ways, perhaps 8 centuries earlier. Behind them lay India, Persia, Armenia, the Caliphate, the Steppes, Byzantium, and the Balkans. Ahead of them lay Europe, which would turn out to be, in its own distinctive ways, just as complicated. Every May, the small coastal town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer in the Camargue region of southern France becomes, for a few days, one of the most extraordinary gatherings in Europe. Thousands of Roma from across the continent, from Spain, from Romania, from Hungary, from Germany, from countries that did not exist when this tradition began, converge on this sun-bleached town at the mouth of the Rhone Delta to honour a dark-skinned statue of a woman kept in the crypt of the local church. They come in caravans and on foot and by car. They fill the streets with music and prayer and argument and celebration, and they carry the statue in a procession to the sea with a fervour that the surrounding population, which is mostly watching with a mixture of respect and mild bewilderment, finds difficult to entirely explain. The woman in the crypt is called Sara Lakali, or St. Sarah, or the Black Madonna of the Gypsies, depending on who you ask and which tradition they are drawing from. The Catholic Church officially recognises her as a servant of the two Marys whose names the town bears, Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany in some traditions, 2 other Marys in others, who are said to have arrived on this coast by boat after the crucifixion. Sarah, in this telling, was their Egyptian servant who had preceded them to France. The Roma pilgrims who crowd into the crypt to touch Sarah's statue and press their faces to her robes have a somewhat different understanding of who she is. For them, she's something older and deeper than any servant story, and the Catholic framing, while accepted on its surface, sits over a layer of meaning that has very little to do with Egyptian servants or apostolic traditions. Understanding what Sara Lakali actually means to Roma communities requires going back, as so many Roma stories do, to India, specifically to the tradition of Shaktism, the strand of Hindu religious practice that centers on the goddess as the primary divine force in the universe. In Shakta theology, the goddess, Devi in her many forms, including Durga, Parvati, and most relevantly Kali, is not a peripheral figure or a consort to a more important male deity. She is the fundamental power of existence itself, creative, destructive, nurturing, terrifying, all at once. Her worship involves direct emotional relationship, intense devotion, and the understanding that the divine is not distant or abstract but intimately present in the material world, including in its most difficult aspects. Kali specifically, whose name means black or time, and who is depicted with dark skin, dishevelled hair, and a necklace of skulls, standing on the prostrate body of her consort Shiva, represents the face of the divine that does not look away from death, destruction, and the end of things. She is not evil. She is honest, which is sometimes the more unsettling option. Her devotees throughout history have included people on the margins of mainstream society, those who dealt with death, those whose lives were precarious, those who needed a deity who understood what it was like to exist outside the comfortable centre of things. The communities that eventually became the Roma, occupying the marginal social positions already described, had strong cultural reasons to maintain connections with goddess-centered worship, even as they travelled through societies with very different religious frameworks. The name Kali Sara does not need elaborate decoding. Sara is a name that exists in multiple traditions: Hebrew, Arabic, various European languages, meaning princess or noble woman. But in the Roma context, the pairing with Kali is unlikely to be coincidental. Kali Sara, the Black Sara, the Dark Sara. The description matches the iconography of the Indian goddess with a precision that is difficult to attribute entirely to chance, especially given everything else we know about the Indian origins of Roma culture. What happened, over centuries of migration through Muslim and Christian territories, is that the goddess was not abandoned. She was translated. She acquired new names, new stories, new liturgical frameworks. She became compatible with whatever official religion surrounded the Roma community at any given time. But underneath the translation, the devotional structure, the direct, intimate, emotionally intense relationship with a powerful feminine divine presence who was dark-skinned and associated with both protection and transformation, remained recognizable. This process of religious translation is called syncretism, and it is one of the most common mechanisms by which minority communities maintain their religious traditions under pressure from dominant cultures. The strategy is essentially this: find the element of the official religion that most closely corresponds to what you already believe, adopt the official name and story, and continue the underlying practice. It is not deception, or at least, it is not primarily deception. It is adaptation, the same adaptive intelligence that allowed Roma communities to maintain their language while learning the local language, to practice their traditional crafts while fitting into local economic systems. The religion adapted too, because that is what religions do when they need to survive in new environments. The Catholic Church, for its part, was not entirely blind to what was happening. Church officials in various periods expressed concern about the nature of Roma religious practice, about whether the veneration of Sara was entirely orthodox, about what exactly was going on in the crypt at Sainte-Marie de la Mer during the May pilgrimage. At various times, church authorities attempted to regulate or redirect Roma religious practice in ways that would bring it more clearly within Catholic norms. The results were, in the long view, mixed. The pilgrimages continued. Sarah's cult persisted. The Roma came every year with their music and their candles, and their deeply felt devotion to a figure who was officially a servant, but functionally something considerably more ancient. The veneration of Sarah Kali is the most visible and dramatically documented example of Roma religious syncretism, but it is far from the only one. Understanding the full spiritual world of Roma communities requires looking at several interlocking systems of belief and practice that together form a coherent cosmology, one that is distinctively Roma even though each element can be traced to one of the cultures the Roma passed through. The concept that provides the organizing logic of traditional Roma spiritual life is generally described by scholars using the term kuntari, though terminology varies between different Roma communities and dialects. Kuntari refers to a principle of universal balance, the idea that the cosmos operates according to forces that must be kept in equilibrium, and that the actions of individuals have consequences that ripple outward through the community and beyond. This is not quite karma in the Hindu sense, though the structural resemblance is clear enough that the Indian connection is almost certainly not coincidental. It is also not quite the Christian concept of sin and redemption, though Roma communities living within Christian contexts naturally described it partly in those terms. It is something that draws on both, arriving at a framework that is its own thing. The practical expression of Kuntari in daily Roma life is most clearly visible in the system known as marime, which is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Roma culture among outside observers. Marime is generally translated as pollution or ritual impurity, which is technically accurate but gives the impression of something primarily negative, a set of prohibitions against things that are bad or dangerous. That is a misreading. Marime is better understood as a system of managing the boundary between sacred and profane, pure and impure inside the community and outside it, a system that determines which people, objects, actions, and spaces require specific protocols to handle safely. The logic of marime is deeply practical. Certain parts of the human body are considered marime in a way that requires care in handling. Specifically, the lower half of the body is considered more impure than the upper half, which is why washing clothes requires careful separation of upper and lower garments, why a woman's skirts must not touch food preparation areas, why certain spatial arrangements in living quarters follow specific rules about what goes where. This is not arbitrary. It is a hygiene system with a spiritual framework, the kind of arrangement that was considerably more effective than many alternatives available in the pre-modern world, and that additionally served as a marker of community identity and an expression of care for the body as something that deserved attention and respect. The marime system also governs social interactions, and this is where its implications extend beyond personal hygiene into community organisation. Interactions with Gadjo, the Roma term for non-Roma people, are regulated by marime in ways that reflect a community's understanding of its own distinctiveness. This is not straightforwardly a statement that Gadjo are inferior or impure in a moral sense. It is, more precisely, an acknowledgement that the Roma community has its own purity system, and that interactions with people operating outside that system require specific protocols to manage the interface. The analogy to caste-based purity rules from India is obvious, and scholars have argued extensively about whether marime is a direct descendant of Indian caste pollution concepts, a parallel development, or some combination. The balance of evidence suggests genuine historical continuity, though the concept was clearly adapted and elaborated during the journey westward. What makes the marime system remarkable from a cultural survival perspective is how much work it does simultaneously. It is a hygiene system, a community boundary marker, a system of social sanctions, a framework for conflict resolution, and a spiritual cosmology all at once. Violating marime has practical consequences. A person declared marime by community judgment is excluded from the community's social life until the matter is resolved. But those practical consequences are embedded in a spiritual framework that gives them weight beyond mere social pressure. The cosmos cares about these boundaries. The balance that Kuntari describes requires them. The community enforces them not just because breaking them is antisocial, but because maintaining them is part of a right relationship with reality. There is a dimension of marime that outside observers have consistently misread as simple antisocial behaviour or clannishness, and it is worth correcting that misreading here. The strong preference for handling community disputes internally, through the judgment of respected elders rather than through external legal systems, is not simply distrust of outsiders, though centuries of rather justified experience with hostile external authorities has certainly reinforced that preference. It is the practical expression of a belief that the community has its own legitimate mechanisms for adjudicating disputes, mechanisms that are rooted in the same cosmological understanding as marime itself. Outsiders cannot adjudicate Roma disputes fairly, not because they are enemies, but because they do not understand the framework within which the dispute is meaningful. A non-Roma judge applying non-Roma law to a conflict that arose from a marime violation is, from the Roma perspective, trying to fix a problem with the wrong tools. The repair requires the right tools, which means the right people, which means the community. This internal justice system, called Kris in many Roma communities, or Divano in others, depending on the regional tradition, is a structured deliberative process in which community members hear a dispute, consider the testimony and character of those involved, weigh the applicable norms, and arrive at a judgment that carries communal authority. The judgment can involve compensation, exclusion, or formal reconciliation, depending on the nature of the offence. The process is not a simple matter of whoever shouts loudest or whoever has the most powerful relatives. It has rules, procedures, and a concept of fairness that, while different from the legal traditions of surrounding societies, is not arbitrary. For communities that spent centuries being the target of legal systems rather than the beneficiaries of them, having a parallel internal system of justice was not just culturally meaningful, but practically essential. The figure who mediates this system, the person whose authority is invoked in serious marame judgments and community disputes, is traditionally the Rom Baro, the big man or respected elder, whose authority derives partly from age and experience and partly from understood spiritual legitimacy. But the spiritual specialist who deals with the invisible dimensions of community life, illness, misfortune, the intervention of the dead in the world of the living, is a different figure, and often a woman, the Drabadi, the healer and seer, whose knowledge includes the medicinal properties of plants, the interpretation of dreams, the detection of curses, and the ability to negotiate with forces that ordinary community members cannot perceive directly. Before going further into what Drabadi practice involves, it is worth pausing on a small etymological detail that is easy to miss but rather illuminating. The Romani word drab, from which Drabadi derives, means medicine, herb, or remedy, not magic, not spell, not curse, remedy. The Drabadi is not primarily a magician in the European theatrical sense. She is a person who knows remedies, in the broadest possible sense of that word, remedies for illness, remedies for bad luck, remedies for the disturbances in the invisible world that manifest as visible suffering. This framing, the healer, as someone with practical knowledge of remedies rather than supernatural powers, is considerably less dramatic than popular imagination tends to suggest, and considerably more accurate. The Drabadi tradition is one of the most direct lines of continuity between Roma spiritual practice and its Indian roots. The figure of the woman healer-seer who works with plants, reads signs, and negotiates between the human and spirit worlds is found across South Asian traditions, and the specific techniques associated with Roma Drabani, including reading palms, interpreting patterns, working with protective charms, have structural parallels in Indian folk practice that scholars have documented. By the time Roma communities arrived in Western Europe and began offering fortune-telling services to European populations, they were practicing a tradition that was ancient. The fortune-teller as a Roma cultural figure was not invented for European audiences. It was a translation of an existing specialist role into a context where European audiences were willing to pay for it. The belief system that underlies Drabadi practice includes concepts about the nature of the soul and what happens after death that again show that double register of Indian origin and local adaptation. The Romani concept of the soul, sometimes called the ji or diji, a word related to Sanskrit jiva, meaning life or soul, is not identical to either Hindu or Christian understandings, but shows traces of both. The ji is understood as the animating force of a person, something that persists after death and requires proper treatment through funerary ritual and subsequent mourning practices. The dead, in traditional Roma understanding, remain present in the world of the living in ways that require careful management. They can protect, but they can also disturb, and the line between the ancestor who watches over the family and the mullo, the spirit of the dead who has returned to cause trouble, is one that Roma mortuary practice is specifically designed to navigate. The mullo tradition is one of the more dramatic elements of Roma spiritual cosmology, and it has fed into European folklore about vampires and the undead in ways that are well documented and somewhat ironic, given that Roma communities were often on the receiving end of European superstition rather than the source of it. The mullo is not quite a vampire in the Dracula sense. The famous Dracula novel by Bram Stoker was itself shaped by Eastern European folklore that had, in various regions, absorbed Roma spiritual concepts alongside local traditions and produced something new and distinctively disturbing. The mullo is a spirit that has not completed its transition from the world of the living, usually because of violent or untimely death, unresolved disputes, or improper funeral rites. The Roma mortuary traditions designed to prevent mullo activity are elaborate and specific. The possessions of the dead must be handled carefully. In some traditions, clothing and personal items are burned. In others, they are distributed or destroyed in specific ways. The period immediately following death is one of heightened ritual attention, with the community gathering, the body being prepared according to specific protocols, and the living maintaining vigil in ways that serve both to honor the dead and to ensure that the transition proceeds correctly. There are restrictions on what the living may do during the mourning period, and there are specific points at which the mourning officially ends and normal life resumes. All of this is designed to help the JI complete its journey from the world of the living and to prevent the conditions that create a mullow. That these practices fed into European vampire folklore is, in retrospect, not surprising. Roma communities in the Balkans and Eastern Europe were among the first to document and describe mullow-related experiences to curious outside observers who naturally filtered what they heard through their own existing frameworks about the dead returning. The result was a folk tradition that borrowed Roma cosmological concepts without crediting them, then attributed the resulting beliefs back to Roma communities as evidence of their supposed primitiveness. This is a pattern that appears throughout Roma cultural history. Roma contributions to European culture were absorbed while Roma people themselves were marginalized. And it applies to religious concepts just as it applies to music and language. Reincarnation, in various forms, appears in the belief systems of many Roma communities, though the specific formulation varies. The idea that the JI does not simply end at death but continues in some form, potentially returning in a new life, potentially influencing the lives of descendants, potentially requiring specific ritual work to ensure a good transition, is consistent with both Hindu concepts of rebirth and with the kind of ancestral spirit belief found in many folk traditions. Roma communities in different regions have elaborated this differently, but the general principle that death is a transition rather than an endpoint, and that the living have specific responsibilities toward the recently dead, is widespread. What is particularly striking about all of these elements, Kuntari, Marame, Drabadi, the Mullo, the concept of the G, is that they form a coherent system. They are not random survivals of disconnected practices. They fit together into a worldview that makes sense on its own terms, that answers the fundamental questions any religious system has to answer. How should we live? What happens when we die? What is our relationship to the forces that govern the universe? And what do we owe each other and the world around us? The answers Roma tradition provides are distinctive, recognizable as shaped by Indian origins and by centuries of contact with other traditions, but not reducible to any of their sources. They are genuinely Roma. This internal coherence is partly why the system was so resilient in the face of external religious pressure. When a European ruler decided that the Roma in his territory needed to be properly converted to Christianity, and assigned a priest to accomplish this, the priest was working against a religious system that already had answers to all the questions Christianity raised. Roma communities in Catholic countries adopted Catholic saints, attended Mass on the appropriate occasions, baptized their children, and otherwise performed Christianity in ways that satisfied the authorities. The internal life of the community, governed by Marame and Kuntari and the Drabadi's knowledge, continued in parallel. From inside the community there was no contradiction. You could venerate Sara Lakali in the church crypt and maintain the Marame system in the household simultaneously, because these were not competing systems. They operated on different registers, addressed different needs, and had been running in parallel for so long that the coexistence felt natural. The same adaptive flexibility applied in Muslim territories. Roma communities in the Ottoman Empire adopted Muslim practices, or at least Muslim-facing practices, with a pragmatic completeness that impressed and occasionally puzzled Ottoman administrators, who appreciated the compliance but were sometimes uncertain how deep it ran. Roma men in Ottoman territories were circumcised, used Islamic names in public contexts, observed the major Islamic festivals, and avoided publicly visible violations of Islamic law. The internal community life, as always, was another matter. The Drabadi's work continued. The Marame system continued. The ancestral practices associated with death and the spirit world continued. The flexibility was not indifference to religion. Roma communities were, by most accounts, genuinely and sometimes intensely religious. It was a sophisticated understanding, developed over centuries, that the religion you show to the outside world and the religion you practice inside the community are not necessarily the same thing, and that survival sometimes requires maintaining both simultaneously. This dual-register approach to religion is not unique to the Roma. It appears in many minority communities throughout history, who practiced their original traditions while publicly conforming to dominant religious norms. What is somewhat unusual in the Roma case is the sheer duration and geographical range over which this adaptation was practiced. A system that worked in Anatolia in the 12th century was still working, in adapted form, in France in the 17th century and in Slovakia in the 21st. The core elements proved extraordinarily portable across not just geographical space, but across radically different religious environments: Hindu, Muslim, Orthodox Christian, Catholic, Protestant, without losing their coherence. Part of what enabled this portability was the fact that Roma religious practice was never centralized in the way that dominant religions were. There was no Roma pope, no Roma caliph, no authoritative scripture that defined orthodox practice and heresy in binding terms. The religious knowledge was distributed, in the Drabadi's expertise, in the community elder's judgment, in the practices passed down through families, in the songs and stories that carried cosmological understanding in encoded form. Without a central authority to corrupt, co-opt, or destroy, the tradition could not be decapitated. It lived in people, in households, in the small gestures of daily life, in the way clothes were washed, in the way the dead were mourned, in the way a healer prepared her remedies, in the way a grandmother explained to a child why certain things were done certain ways. The songs deserve particular mention. Music in Roma communities is not only an economic activity, a profession, or entertainment, though it is all of those things. It is also a carrier of cosmological knowledge, a medium through which the deep structures of the worldview are transmitted across generations, in forms that are memorable precisely because they are beautiful. The specific scales, rhythms, and melodic patterns associated with Roma musical traditions have deep roots in South Asian musical systems. The minor scales and microtonal inflections that give Roma and flamenco music their distinctive emotional character are recognizable to ears trained in Indian classical music in ways that are not coincidental. The concept of deep song, what Spanish Roma call cantejondo, the oldest and most serious form of flamenco, carries within its structure a relationship between the performer, the community, and the invisible world that is not simply entertainment. When a singer performs a cantejondo in a traditional context, with the community gathered, responding, contributing, the performance is also a kind of ritual, a summoning of intensity, a navigation of grief and joy in ways that the community recognizes as having significance beyond aesthetic pleasure. The Romani word for this quality, the ecstatic depth that transforms a performance from skilled entertainment into something that touches the invisible world, is related to concepts found in South Asian musical theory about the power of specific melodic modes to evoke specific emotional and spiritual states. The raga system in Indian classical music rests on the understanding that music is not just pleasant sound, but a technology for moving consciousness into particular states. Roma music, filtered through centuries of contact with Andalusian Arab music and then Spanish Catholic culture, arrived at a different aesthetic vocabulary, but a structurally similar understanding of what music is for. Music was one of the earliest carrier media for Roma identity, and it remained one of the most durable. The pilgrimage to Sainte Marie de la Mer, with which this chapter began, crystallizes all of these threads in a single remarkable event. Roma from across Europe come to honor a figure who is officially a Catholic servant, but experientially something much older. They come with music that has its roots in South Asia. They come following the logic of Kuntari, which makes pilgrimage and collective ritual a form of cosmic maintenance. They come because Sara Lakali, whatever her official name, whatever story the Church tells about her origins, is theirs in a way that no official account fully captures. She is dark-skinned and powerful and protective and present, and she has been travelled to for generations, and the travelling itself is part of who Roma people are. The Trishul, the three-pronged trident associated with the god Shiva in Hindu iconography, appears in Roma decorative traditions and symbolic vocabulary in ways that have attracted scholarly attention precisely because of its persistence. The trident as a symbol survives in Roma metalwork, in tattoo traditions, in amulets, in decorative patterns applied to wagons and doorways. Its presence is another thread connecting contemporary Roma culture to its Indian origins, a visual echo of a religious tradition that the journey transformed but did not erase. What the spiritual world of the Roma demonstrates, more clearly than perhaps any other aspect of their culture, is the difference between adaptation and surrender. Every element of Roma religious life adapted across the centuries of migration, borrowed names, borrowed stories, borrowed ritual frameworks from every culture the community passed through. But the underlying structure, the logic of how the invisible world works and what it requires of the living, was never surrendered. It was translated over and over into whatever language the surrounding culture could hear, and in the translation, remarkably, it survived. The persistence of that spiritual core across such varied religious landscapes, Hindu adjacent in the earliest period, encountering Zoroastrian elements in Persia, navigating Christian and Muslim territories across the medieval Mediterranean, adapting to the specific demands of Catholic Spain, Orthodox Romania, Protestant Germany, secular France, required something that is not quite faith in the conventional sense, and not quite stubbornness, and not quite strategy. It required, more than anything, the ability to hold two things simultaneously: a sincere engagement with the world as it is, meaning the dominant religious culture of wherever the community found itself, and an equally sincere maintenance of the world as the community understood it from inside, the world governed by Kuntari and Marimé, and the knowledge of the Drabadi. Most religious traditions find this kind of coexistence uncomfortable, and demand that their adherents choose one framework or the other. Roma spiritual culture was built from the beginning on the understanding that the world has multiple registers, that what you do in public and what you do in the household are both real, and that navigating the space between them is not hypocrisy, but wisdom. This is perhaps the deepest gift of the long journey, a spiritual flexibility that could bend enormously without breaking, that could absorb and adapt and translate without losing the thread of what it was. Sara Lakali stands in her crypt in Sainte-Marie de la Mer, dark-skinned and jewelled and surrounded by candles and prayers in a dozen languages. Every May, the Roma come to her from across a continent, and the music they bring with them carries frequencies that originated thousands of miles away and 1,000 years ago. The church that houses her has its own story about who she is. The Roma have theirs. Both are true in the ways that matter to the people who hold them, and neither cancels the other out. That, in miniature, is the spiritual genius of a people who have spent a millennium learning that identity does not require a single fixed point, that the divine can be carried as well as housed, and that the most durable form of a sacred tradition is one that knows how to travel. The first time Roma communities appear in Byzantine administrative records with any clarity, they are already being taxed. This is, in its own way, a milestone. In the Byzantine bureaucratic universe, being taxed meant you existed officially, which was an improvement over being invisible. The documents are dry, as tax records tend to be, and they describe communities of smiths and craftspeople and animal trainers living in or near Byzantine cities, paying levies on their trades, occupying a defined, if informal, position in the imperial economic system. Nobody in the Byzantine chancellery appears to have been particularly curious about where these people came from or what their history was. They made useful things and they paid their dues, which was essentially the entire job description for a productive subject of the empire. This administrative matter-of-factness is actually significant. The Byzantine Empire by the 11th and 12th centuries was a sophisticated, cosmopolitan state that had spent centuries absorbing and integrating populations from an enormous range of backgrounds. It had been at various times under pressure from Arab armies, Slavic migrations, Bulgarian kingdoms, Crusader adventurism, and a rotating caste of steppe nomads, and had responded to all of this with the kind of institutional flexibility that comes from having survived roughly 800 years of near-continuous crisis. By Byzantine standards, a community of travelling craftspeople of obscure Eastern origin was not particularly remarkable. The empire had seen stranger things before breakfast. What made the Roma presence in Byzantine territory significant in the long run was not how the Byzantines reacted to them, which was largely with bureaucratic indifference, but what happened to Roma communities during their time in the Byzantine world. This was the period, as described in the previous chapters, when the deepest layers of Greek vocabulary entered the Romani language, when the communities that had been travelling separately for generations began to cohere into a more unified cultural identity, and when the social framework that would characterize Roma life in Europe for centuries was refined into its recognizable form. The geography of the Byzantine Empire at its various stages of contraction and expansion covered precisely the territories, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Greek islands, the coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean, that Roma communities needed to traverse to reach the European interior. The empire was not a wall but a corridor, and Roma communities moved through it in both directions, settling in some areas for generations while continuing to maintain the seasonal circuits and trade routes that their economic life depended on. the Peloponnese, Macedonia, Thrace, the coast of what is now Bulgaria and Romania. These regions all show documentary evidence of Roma presence in the Byzantine period, and the names that Byzantine sources give to Roma communities, Atsincani, Egyptiani, tinkers of various designations, begin appearing with increasing frequency as the 12th century progresses. A Venetian document from the late 14th century, Venice having significant commercial interests in the eastern Mediterranean and therefore excellent record-keeping about everything that moved through it, mentions a group described as people of Egyptian origin living in a settlement near Methone in the Peloponnese, practicing smithing and small-scale trade. Methone was a Venetian-controlled port at this point, which is why the record exists at all. Venetian administrators documented taxable activity with the diligence of people who were running a commercial enterprise rather than an empire, and commercial enterprises notice revenue-generating populations that empires sometimes overlook. The description of the community, their crafts, their settlement pattern, their apparent organization, matches closely with what later Western European sources would describe as Roma communities, and historians generally treat this document as one of the earliest clear references to Roma presence in the Balkans. Another document, from the monastery of the Great Lavra on Mount Athos, dated to 1378, refers to a group of Atsincani who had been present in the region for some time, and whose relationship with the monastery involved a combination of craft services and informal economic exchange. The monks were not entirely sure how to categorize these neighbors. The document reflects a certain institutional uncertainty about which administrative and religious category applied, but they were clearly not a new or unfamiliar presence. The implication is that Roma communities had been in this region long enough that their relationship with established institutions like the monastery had developed its own informal norms, its own expectations and practices, its own history of interaction. That does not happen overnight. The Atsincani designation, whose etymology and subsequent linguistic career was traced in the previous chapter, tells us something interesting about how Byzantine society perceived these communities beyond simply noting their existence. The term connects to concepts of ritual separation, of not being touched, that suggest Byzantine observers noticed something about Roma social practices, specifically the marime-based system of maintaining boundaries between the community and outsiders, and found it notable enough to name. The name stuck, travelled through Slavic languages and then into German and French, and eventually became the basis for Zigeuner, Ziegen, and all their cognates across European languages. A bureaucratic observation about social customs became an ethnic label that followed Roma communities across an entire continent. There is a lesson in that about how minority communities get defined by the categories that dominant societies find convenient, which is a lesson that Roma history illustrates repeatedly and without apparent end. Byzantine economic life created specific niches that Roma communities occupied with considerable success. Metalworking was the most important of these, and it is worth spending a moment on why this particular skill was so persistently associated with Roma communities across such a wide range of times and places. Iron and copper tools were fundamental to agricultural civilization. You could not plough, harvest, or process grain at scale without them, but the production and maintenance of iron tools required specialized knowledge and equipment that most rural communities could not sustain independently. A traveling smith who moved through a circuit of villages, repairing and replacing agricultural tools on a seasonal basis, was providing a service that was genuinely essential and that the settled community could not easily replace. The economics were straightforward. The smith needed a market for his services, and the villages needed the services, and the arrangement worked as long as both parties kept their side of it. The same logic applied to other Roma crafts: the repair of copper pots and vessels, the manufacture of small wooden implements, the working of leather, the trade in horses and livestock. These were all services that rural and even urban communities needed, and that required either specialized skill, specialized knowledge of markets and prices, or both. Roma communities, with their networks of kinship and communication, extending across enormous distances, were in an excellent position to provide the kind of market information about prices in distant cities, about demand for particular goods, about where quality materials could be obtained, that isolated communities lacked. The information value of a community that travelled widely and maintained contacts across a large region was, in pre-modern economies, genuinely substantial. It is worth pausing on the economics of horse trading specifically, because it illustrates how Roma communities built competitive advantages that were difficult to replicate. A horse trader needs, at minimum, the ability to assess an animal's health and soundness, knowledge of current prices in multiple markets, connections with breeders and buyers across a wide region, and a reputation for not selling animals that die within a week of purchase. The last item is arguably the most important and the hardest to build. Reputation in pre-modern markets was not transferable between strangers. You needed someone to vouch for you, or you needed to have done business with the buyer before. Roma horse traders, operating within networks of community trust and kinship that extended across large distances, could function in markets where individual strangers could not. When a Roma horse trader arrived in a market, he came with an implicit guarantee. The network he represented would stand behind the transaction, because the network's reputation was the currency. A buyer who was cheated could not simply sue the trader and move on. The complaint would travel through Roma community networks, and a trader who cheated buyers would find his access to the community's trading networks curtailed in ways that were economically devastating. The system worked because it was embedded in social structures that had real enforcement mechanisms, and those mechanisms were ultimately rooted in the same community solidarity that the Marem system organized. The Byzantine military also found uses for Roma skills that were somewhat less obvious than agricultural tool repair. Smiths who could produce and maintain weapons were valuable to any military establishment, and there are references in Byzantine sources to Roma craftspeople working in contexts associated with military supply. The horse trade was particularly significant. Horses were the primary military technology of the medieval world, and communities with deep knowledge of horse breeding, training, health, and trading were useful to rulers who needed to maintain cavalry forces. Roma expertise in horsemanship and horse medicine, knowledge that was ancient, transmitted through generations and not easily replicable by outsiders, had military value that occasionally translated into formal arrangements with Byzantine administrators. This pattern, Roma communities providing specialized services to state and military establishments in exchange for a degree of official tolerance or protection, would repeat itself in the Ottoman period and to varying degrees in Western European contexts as well. It was never a comfortable arrangement, and the protection it offered was always conditional and revocable. But it provided a framework within which Roma communities could operate without constant active persecution, which was a significant practical advantage. The fall of Constantinople to Ottoman forces in 1453 is conventionally treated as one of the major discontinuities in European history. The end of the Byzantine world, the beginning of the early modern period, the moment when the last institutional link to Roman antiquity was severed. For Roma communities in the Balkans, it was something different, a change of management, handled with the pragmatic calm of people who had already survived several changes of management and expected to survive several more. The specific empire they were operating within changed. The fundamental dynamics of their situation, skilled minority community navigating the demands of a large, powerful state while maintaining internal cultural autonomy, did not change at all. If anything, the Ottoman Empire initially offered Roma communities conditions that were in some respects more favourable than the later Byzantine period, which had become increasingly chaotic and hospitable to nobody in particular. The Ottoman state was, by the standards of the medieval and early modern world, remarkably sophisticated in its management of religious and ethnic diversity. This was partly pragmatic necessity. The empire encompassed an enormous range of populations with different religions, languages, and customs, and trying to homogenize all of them would have been both practically impossible and economically counterproductive. The millet system, which organized the empire's non-Muslim subjects into semi-autonomous communities, governed by their own religious laws in matters of personal status, gave minorities a degree of self-governance that was unusual for the period. Christians lived under Christian law for marriage, inheritance, and community affairs. Jews lived under Jewish law. Muslims lived under Islamic law. The empire collected taxes from all of them and otherwise interfered in their internal arrangements less than most European states of the same period would have. Roma communities presented a particular categorization challenge for Ottoman administrators, and the Ottoman bureaucratic record reveals the difficulty with a kind of unintentional transparency. The standard millet categories assumed stable, territorially rooted communities organized around a religious institution, a church, a synagogue, a mosque, that could serve as the administrative interlocutor between the community and the state. Roma communities did not have fixed religious institutions in the same sense, moved through multiple administrative jurisdictions, and often presented different religious faces in different contexts. Ottoman tax registers from the 15th and 16th centuries occasionally note Roma communities in ways that suggest genuine administrative puzzlement. Here is a community that is Muslim according to its own account, pays its taxes, and moves unpredictably between 3 different provincial jurisdictions. How to classify them was a question the bureaucracy never entirely resolved, and the workarounds developed at the local level were creative enough to suggest that Ottoman administrators on the ground were considerably more pragmatic than the formal categories implied. Roma communities entered this system with their characteristic pragmatic flexibility. In Ottoman-controlled territories, Roma who adopted Islam, or who performed Islam convincingly enough to satisfy the relevant authorities, could access opportunities that were formally closed to non-Muslims: certain trades, certain positions, access to certain markets. Ottoman administrative records from the 15th and 16th centuries document Roma communities paying taxes as Muslim subjects, and these records often note the specific occupations being taxed: smiths, musicians, horse traders, entertainers. The Ottoman tax authorities were nothing if not thorough, and their records constitute one of the most detailed pictures we have of Roma economic life in any historical period. The relationship was genuinely more complex than simple calculation, however. Many Roma communities in Ottoman territory were Muslim, not just as a tax-paying strategy, but in ways that were experientially real, even as the internal spiritual practices described in the previous chapter continued in parallel. Generations of living within Muslim cultural frameworks, using Arabic and Turkish phrases in daily life, participating in the rhythms of the Islamic calendar, naming children with Muslim names, created genuine cultural hybridity. The Roma communities that emerged from centuries of Ottoman rule were not the same as the Roma communities that had arrived from the Byzantine world. They had absorbed Ottoman culture as thoroughly as they had absorbed Byzantine culture, and this absorption was visible in language, in material culture, in music, and in religious practice. The musical dimension of this Ottoman influence deserves particular attention because it is where the absorption is most audible and most lasting. Ottoman court music, itself a synthesis of Byzantine, Persian, Arab, and Turkish elements, was a sophisticated tradition with its own elaborate theoretical framework, a system of makam, melodic modes that specified not just which notes could be used but how phrases should be constructed, what emotional character the music should have, what times of day or ceremonial context each mode was suited to. This is structurally parallel to the raga system in Indian classical music, which the ancestors of the Roma would have known before the migration began. Roma musicians moving into Ottoman musical life were not encountering an entirely alien system. The underlying logic, that specific modal configurations carry specific emotional and spiritual qualities, was something their musical tradition had always understood, even if the specific modes were different. The adaptation was not a translation from a familiar system to a foreign one. It was a recognition of a family resemblance, followed by a new synthesis. Roma musicians in Ottoman territory became deeply embedded in this tradition, serving as performers at court, in coffee houses, at celebrations, and in the popular music of the cities and towns. The coffee house culture of Ottoman cities, which was itself a relatively new institution in the 16th and 17th centuries, coffee having arrived in the Ottoman world from Yemen, and immediately generated both enthusiasm and a certain amount of religious controversy about whether a stimulating beverage consumed in a public social space was compatible with proper Muslim conduct, created a sustained demand for professional musicians that Roma communities were well positioned to supply. The coffeehouse musician needed to know a broad repertoire, to be able to improvise and respond to audience requests, to work in the specific acoustic and social environment of a room full of people who were there primarily to talk and drink and happened to be listening. These were skills that professional Roma musicians had been developing for generations, and the coffeehouse circuit became an important economic foundation for Roma musical life in Ottoman cities. At the same time, the Ottoman presence created a division within Roma populations that persists to the present day. Roma communities in territories that remained under Byzantine or subsequent Eastern Orthodox Christian rule, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, later Romania, maintained Orthodox Christian identities, or at least Orthodox-facing identities, with the same pragmatic flexibility they brought to Islam elsewhere. Those in territories under more sustained Ottoman Muslim rule adopted Muslim frameworks. Those who had moved further west before the Ottoman expansion had already adopted Catholic or eventually Protestant identities. The result, by the 17th or 18th century, was a Roma population that was Christian in some regions, Muslim in others, and further divided between Orthodox, Catholic and various Protestant denominations depending on which state they were living in and when they had arrived. This religious fragmentation is often treated as a complication or a weakness in discussions of Roma identity, and it is true that it created real divisions that persist to the present day. Roma Muslims in Bosnia and Roma Catholics in Hungary shared an ethnic and cultural origin, but had spent centuries developing inside radically different religious and cultural frameworks, and those centuries left marks. The dialects diverged, the music diverged, the material culture diverged, the specific shape of the Marim system in its local applications diverged. Roma from different regional and religious backgrounds who encounter each other sometimes report genuine culture shock at discovering how different their versions of a shared heritage look from the outside. And yet the core, the language, the social logic, the fundamental understanding of what Roma identity means, remained recognizable across all of those divergences. The fragmentation was real. The underlying unity was also real. Both things were simultaneously true, which is a situation Roma culture had been navigating since before it arrived in Europe. The Ottoman military, like its Byzantine predecessor, found specific uses for Roma communities beyond craft services. The most unusual and historically specific of these was the role of certain Roma communities in the production and maintenance of weapons, particularly in the great imperial arsenals that supplied the Ottoman military machine. The Tofane arsenal in Constantinople, the massive weapons production facility that supplied the Ottoman artillery that would become famous across the Mediterranean world, employed craftspeople of various backgrounds, and Roma smiths are documented in the records of such establishments. The connection between Roma metalworking expertise and military production that had been visible in the Byzantine period deepened in the Ottoman context, partly because the scale of Ottoman military production was so much larger. There is also evidence of Roma communities in more directly military roles, particularly in irregular formations associated with the Ottoman frontier forces. The Akinci, the irregular cavalry raiders who operated on Ottoman frontiers, conducting reconnaissance and disruption operations, were drawn from various population groups with the skills and mobility the role required. Communities accustomed to movement, with knowledge of terrain and horses, with networks of information extending across wide areas, were obvious candidates for recruitment into such formations. Whether and how extensively Roma communities participated in this kind of irregular military activity is a matter of ongoing historical research, but the presence of Roma individuals in Ottoman military-adjacent contexts is documented enough to be noted. Beyond the smiths and soldiers and musicians, Roma communities in Ottoman territory occupied a social niche that was simultaneously more and less comfortable than what they encountered in Christian Europe. More comfortable in the sense that the Ottoman system, whatever its many imperfections, was not structured around the specific kind of anti-Roma hostility that would characterize much of Western European law and practice in the same period. The Ottoman state wanted Roma subjects to be productive, taxable, and not disruptive. If those conditions were met, the specific ethnic or cultural identity of those subjects was not a primary concern. Less comfortable in the sense that the Ottoman system still operated on assumptions about settled, stable community organization that did not map well onto Roma patterns of mobility, and that the legal and social status of mobile communities was always ambiguous in ways that created practical difficulties. One Ottoman institutional adaptation that partially addressed this ambiguity was the incorporation of Roma craftspeople into the Esnaf system, the guild-like trade associations that organized professional life in Ottoman cities and towns. Membership in an Esnaf provided a degree of official recognition, a framework for regulating trade practices and prices, and a formal relationship with the state that was considerably more legible to Ottoman administrators than informal itinerant trading. Roma smiths, musicians, and other craftspeople in major Ottoman cities sometimes appear in Esnaf records as members of the relevant professional associations, paying guild dues and operating under guild regulations alongside non-Roma practitioners of the same trades. This integration into formal Ottoman professional structures was partial and uneven. It applied more readily to Roma communities with stable urban bases than to those maintaining mobile circuits. It applied more readily to trades with established guild structures than to activities like fortune-telling or informal livestock trading, which operated outside formal guild frameworks. And it coexisted always with the Roma community's own internal organisation. The ESNAF membership did not replace the Kris or the community elders' authority. It simply added a layer of official affiliation that made interactions with Ottoman administrative structures smoother. The internal and external systems ran in parallel as they always had. The tension between mobility and the requirements of settled administrative systems is a constant in Roma history, across every empire and state they inhabited, and the Ottoman Empire was no exception. Ottoman tax registers identified Roma communities in specific locations and assigned them to specific administrative units, which worked reasonably well for communities that maintained a regular circuit and could be found in roughly predictable places at predictable times. It worked less well for communities that moved more irregularly, whose circuit patterns did not align with administrative boundaries, or whose economic activities took them across the jurisdictions of multiple local authorities. The paperwork implications were apparently considerable. The religious division created by the Byzantine-Ottoman split also played out in material culture in ways that are still visible today. Roma communities in formerly Ottoman Muslim territories developed distinctive material traditions, in textile design, in jewellery, in music, that reflect centuries of Islamic aesthetic influence. Roma communities in Orthodox Christian territories developed different but equally distinctive material traditions, reflecting the visual and musical world of Eastern Christianity. Catholic Roma in Western and Central Europe developed yet another aesthetic register. The convergence of these different traditions at Pan-Roma gatherings, at Sainte-Marie de la Mer for instance, where Roma from the full range of regional and religious backgrounds come together, creates a diversity that is sometimes startling to outsiders who expect Roma culture to be uniform, and is sometimes startling even to Roma themselves, who may not have spent much time with communities whose version of shared heritage looks rather different from their own. What unified Roma communities across this religious and cultural fragmentation was not religion. They had three of those, sometimes running simultaneously in different branches of the same family, and not a shared political allegiance since they had none. What unified them was the language and the social system, the Romani tongue in its many dialects, the Marimé framework, the institution of the Kris, the understanding of what it meant to be Roma and what it meant to be Gaggio, and how to navigate the space between those two categories. These elements persisted across every empire, every religious conversion, every administrative category into which outside authorities tried to sort Roma communities. They persisted because they were maintained by people, in families, in households, in the small daily practices that constitute a culture before culture becomes a monument to itself. There is something worth noting about the particular relationship Roma communities developed with the very different legal and social systems of Byzantium and the Ottoman Empire. In both cases, Roma communities were subject to laws and regulations that were not designed with them in mind, and that frequently created practical difficulties. Byzantine property law, which was designed around settled landowning communities, did not provide straightforward mechanisms for mobile communities to document their rights or resolve disputes through official channels. Ottoman land tenure systems, similarly, were organised around fixed settlement and agricultural production in ways that made Roma patterns of seasonal mobility administratively awkward. In both cases, Roma communities responded by developing sophisticated parallel systems, the Kris, the community networks, the informal agreements with local officials, that allowed them to operate effectively without depending on official legal mechanisms that worked against rather than for them. This parallel legal existence was not rebellion or lawlessness. It was practical adaptation to a situation in which the official system was not designed to serve Roma interests. The capacity to function without depending on official structures, to resolve disputes internally, to maintain economic relationships through community trust rather than legal contract, to protect community members through collective action rather than judicial appeal, was developed in the Byzantine and Ottoman periods and would prove essential in the centuries to come, when the official structures of Western European states would be actively hostile rather than merely indifferent. The centuries between two empires were, in this sense, not a waiting room but a workshop, the place where the tools for surviving everything that came next were built, tested, and refined. The two great empires, Byzantine and Ottoman, shaped Roma communities in profound and lasting ways, giving them the religious identities they carry today, embedding Ottoman and Greek elements deep into Roma music and language and material culture, and providing the specific social niches within which Roma economic life was organised for centuries. They also, simply by existing as large, complex, multi-ethnic polities that needed craftspeople and musicians and horse traders and information networks, provided the conditions under which Roma communities could survive and in some respects thrive. Neither empire ever fully understood what it was hosting, and neither tried particularly hard to find out. They taxed it, employed it, occasionally regulated it, and moved on to other concerns. The Roma, for their part, adapted to both, absorbed what was useful from both, and emerged from the Ottoman centuries carrying two civilizations' worth of cultural material, while remaining at the core recognisably themselves. The empires are gone. The Roma are still here, carrying traces of both in everything they do, which is perhaps as good a measure of historical impact as any. While Roma communities in Ottoman territories were navigating guild registries and coffeehouse circuits, something considerably grimmer was unfolding a few hundred miles to the north in the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, the territories that would eventually become Romania. There, beginning in the 14th century and continuing for more than 500 years, Roma people were enslaved, not metaphorically, not in the loose sense that various oppressed groups sometimes deploy the word to describe their conditions. Legally, formally, documentably enslaved, owned as property, bought and sold, inherited, gifted, taxed as livestock, and subject to the complete authority of their owners in ways that no amount of creative euphemism can soften into something more comfortable. This is the chapter of Roma history that almost nobody outside Romania knows, which is remarkable given its scale and duration. The transatlantic slave trade, rightly occupying enormous space in historical consciousness and ongoing public debate, lasted roughly 4 centuries. Roma slavery in the Romanian principalities lasted about the same length of time, involved comparable numbers of people at its peak, and generated comparable levels of human suffering. The reasons for its relative obscurity are not hard to identify. The enslaved were European, the enslavers were European, the geography was peripheral to the histories that Western European and American education systems centre, and the community most directly affected has had limited access to the platforms needed to tell its own story. But the obscurity is not the same as insignificance, and the consequences of those 5 centuries are not ancient history in Romania, they are last week. The origins of Roma slavery in Wallachia and Moldavia are not entirely clear from the documentary record, which is itself a product of the same indifference to Roma lives that characterized the institution throughout its existence. The earliest surviving documents that explicitly describe Roma as the property of nobles and monasteries date from the mid-14th century. The 1385 document in which Wallachian ruler Dan I confirmed a grant of Roma to a monastery is often cited as the earliest clear evidence. But historians generally believe the practice predates the surviving paperwork by at least a few decades. Institutions rarely document practices that have just begun. They document practices that have already stabilized into something requiring official confirmation. What drove the enslavement of Roma in these specific territories at this specific time is a question historians have approached from several directions without arriving at a single clean answer. The timing coincides with the period when Roma communities were arriving in the Balkans in larger numbers, coming from Byzantine territory as the empire's capacity to maintain order in its periphery declined. Wallachia and Moldavia were frontier principalities, caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south and east and the Hungarian kingdom to the west and north, perpetually short of labour for agricultural production, perpetually in need of craftspeople and skilled workers. Roma communities arriving in this region brought precisely the skills that were in demand: metalworking, woodworking, animal husbandry, and they arrived at a moment when local elites had both the need for that labour and the power to simply take it rather than pay for it. There was also a legal and conceptual framework available that made enslavement seem, to the people doing it, like a normal extension of existing practice. Serfdom, the binding of agricultural workers to the land and to the nobles who owned the land, was the standard form of labour organisation in medieval Eastern Europe. The Wallachian and Moldavian boyar class was accustomed to owning the labour of people in formal, heritable ways. Applying this framework to Roman newcomers who lacked the local kinship networks, community ties, and institutional protections that might have made enslavement more difficult required only a modest conceptual extension of what was already being done to the local peasant population. The extension was made, and the documents that survive are its record. The category of Roma slavery that developed in these principalities was distinctive in several ways that set it apart from the serfdom of the local Wallachian and Moldavian population. Serfs were bound to the land. They could not be separated from it without also transferring the land. Roma slaves were personal property, movable and separable from any particular location. A boyar who sold his serfs sold them along with the land they worked. A boyar who sold his Roma slaves sold them as individuals or families, to be taken wherever the buyer wanted, used for whatever the buyer required, and resold whenever the buyer chose. The legal distinction was meaningful in practice. It made Roma slaves more useful to their owners in some respects, because they could be deployed flexibly, and more vulnerable in others, because the connection to a specific place that gave serfs some degree of practical security simply did not exist. Ownership of Roma slaves was divided among three categories of masters, each with slightly different legal relationships to the people they owned. The state, meaning the reigning prince of Wallachia or Moldavia, owned what were called crown slaves, Roma communities that worked on state properties and performed services for the princely court. Boyars owned private slaves, the largest category, who worked on noble estates, performed craft labour, provided domestic services, and could be sold, gifted, mortgaged, or divided among heirs like any other property. Monasteries owned what ecclesiastical records called monastery slaves, Roma communities that worked monastery lands and performed services for religious institutions. The Church's ownership of enslaved people is, even by the generally flexible moral standards of medieval institutions, a detail that tends to make modern readers do a double take. The monasteries, for their part, kept meticulous records of their property, which is one reason we know as much about this system as we do. The categories of Roma slavery were further subdivided by occupation and degree of movement permitted. Vatrai, meaning hearth slaves, were the most settled category, Roma families attached to a specific noble household or estate, performing domestic service, agricultural labour, and craft work in a fixed location. Laesi were nomadic slaves, permitted to travel and practice their trades as long as they paid a regular tribute to their owner and returned when called. Ursari, bear trainers, the people who travelled with trained bears performing for audiences in towns and villages, were a specialised subcategory whose particular skill set made them economically valuable in ways that required mobility, so their owners allowed it while collecting a portion of their earnings. Rudari and Zlotari were Roma specialising in gold washing in rivers and woodworking, respectively, whose activities required access to specific natural resources and therefore some degree of geographic flexibility. This taxonomy of slavery organised by occupation tells you something important about how the institution actually functioned. Roma slaves were not primarily agricultural field labour. That role was filled by the local serf population. They were skilled craftspeople and specialists whose owners valued them precisely for the specialised knowledge they possessed. The smith whose family had practised metalworking for generations, the musician who knew repertoire and performance techniques that no non-Roma musician could easily replicate, the bear trainer whose animals were trained to specific routines. These were not interchangeable units of agricultural muscle. They were specific, skilled individuals whose market value reflected their knowledge and abilities. This made the institution both more economically sophisticated and more personally intimate in its cruelty than plantation-style field labour. A boyar who owned a skilled Roma smith had an economic incentive to keep that smith healthy, trained, and capable. Damaged property was less valuable property, and a dead smith could not be replaced by buying a replacement with identical knowledge. But that same economic logic could be deployed in ways that were extremely coercive. A smith whose children were owned by the same master had a powerful incentive to cooperate, because the consequences of non-cooperation fell not just on him, but on his family. The leverage that family ownership provided to enslavers was profound and deliberate, and the records document cases where families were split, children sold separately from parents, spouses separated, as punishment, as financial convenience, or simply because the market opportunity presented itself. The buying and selling of Roma slaves is documented in remarkable detail because property transactions require documentation, and Romanian archives contain thousands of records of Roma sales, inheritances, and gifts dating from the 15th century onward. A typical document from the 17th century might record the sale of a family, man, woman, and 3 children described by name and approximate age, for a specified price in coins or goods, with the seller's seal and the names of witnesses. The prices varied with age, skill, and health. A skilled adult male smith commanded more than an elderly woman, who commanded more than a young child. The records are dry and businesslike, which is the most disturbing thing about them. The social position of enslaved Roma within Wallachian and Moldavian society was, perhaps obviously, at the very bottom. But the specific character of that position was shaped by the intersection of their slave status with their Roma identity, and disentangling the two in the historical record is sometimes difficult. Enslaved Roma were subject to legal disabilities that went beyond those applied to enslaved members of other groups. They could not testify in court against non-Roma. Their marriages were not formally recognized by the state, which had practical consequences for inheritance and family stability. Their mobility was controlled not just by their individual owners, but by a broader system of social surveillance that treated any Roma person travelling without explicit documentation of their slave status and their master's permission as potentially escaped property. Free Roma, people who were not legally enslaved but who were Roma, existed in these principalities as well, and their situation illustrates the pervasive effects of the institution on Roma life generally. Free Roma were not slaves, but they inhabited a society organised around the assumption that Roma people were appropriately owned, and the practical barriers between free and enslaved status were not always clear from the perspective of a non-Roma Wallachian encountering a Roma person on the road. Documents from the 16th and 17th centuries record cases of free Roma being seized and enslaved by nobles who simply asserted ownership, with the burden of proof falling on the Roma person to demonstrate freedom rather than on the noble to demonstrate ownership. The legal framework, in other words, operated with a default assumption that was the precise inverse of what justice required. The intellectual and theological frameworks that Wallachian and Moldavian society deployed to justify the institution are worth noting, not because they are surprising — systems of domination always generate justificatory frameworks — but because of their specific character. Roma slavery was not primarily justified through religious arguments about paganism or civilizational inferiority, though such arguments appeared occasionally. It was justified primarily through the logic of established practice. We have always done this. The documents confirming our ownership are ancient. Our ancestors owned these people, and we have inherited them along with everything else our ancestors possessed. The circularity of this reasoning, we own them because we have always owned them, was invisible to the people deploying it, as circular justifications tend to be. European travellers who passed through Wallachia and Moldavia in the 18th and early 19th centuries and left accounts of what they saw occasionally expressed surprise or discomfort at the institution of Roma slavery. Some of these accounts contributed to the gradual development of abolitionist sentiment in the principalities, which emerged from a combination of Enlightenment humanitarian philosophy, practical concerns about the economic effects of the institution, and the influence of reformist political movements that swept through Europe in the first half of the 19th century. The Romanian abolitionist movement that developed from the 1830s onward argued, in terms that echo the arguments of abolitionist movements elsewhere, that the enslavement of Roma was morally indefensible, economically counterproductive, and incompatible with the aspirations of a modern European nation-state. Emancipation came in stages. Moldavia freed state-owned Roma slaves in 1844 and church-owned Roma slaves in 1847. Wallachia followed in 1848, freeing both state and church slaves. But privately owned Roma, the largest category, owned by the boyar class, remained enslaved until 1855 in Moldavia and 1856 in Wallachia. The formal union of the two principalities in 1859 and the subsequent legal harmonization confirmed and extended emancipation through the entire territory that was becoming Romania. The dates, 1856 for the emancipation of the largest category of Roma slaves, fall within 2 years of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which makes the parallel unavoidable. The two largest systems of hereditary chattel slavery in the 19th century ended within a decade of each other, on opposite sides of the Atlantic. What emancipation actually meant for the hundreds of thousands of people freed by it was, as in the American case, considerably less than the word suggests. Freedom without land, without capital, without legal standing, without access to education, and without the social networks that come from generations of free civic participation, is a thin kind of freedom. Freed Roma in Romania received no land, no reparations, no institutional support for the transition from enslaved to free status. They were released into a society that had spent 5 centuries treating them as property, and that did not abruptly revise its attitudes because the law had changed. The legal status changed. The social position changed much more slowly, and in some respects did not change at all. The consequences of 5 centuries of slavery in the Romanian principalities are visible in Romanian society to the present day, and they are visible specifically in the poverty, marginalization, and social exclusion experienced by Roma communities in contemporary Romania, which has one of the largest Roma populations in Europe. The specific mechanisms connecting 14th century enslavement to 21st century poverty are not mysterious. 5 centuries of exclusion from property ownership, education, civic participation, and economic accumulation created a structural deficit that emancipation without redistribution could not close in a generation or a century. The communities released from slavery in 1856 had no capital to invest, no land to farm, no credentials to present, and no legal or social infrastructure to protect their newly nominal rights. Their descendants are still dealing with the consequences of that starting position. This matters beyond Romania, because Romanian Roma are the largest single group in the global Roma diaspora, and the specific character of their poverty, the depth of it, the particular ways it manifests, the specific historical experiences that shaped contemporary Roma communities in Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and wherever else Romanian Roma have migrated, is inseparable from the history of slavery. When European governments and media describe Roma poverty as a cultural problem, a matter of choice or values or refusal to integrate, they are ignoring 5 centuries of documented structural causes that produce the conditions they are observing. The history is not a distant abstraction. It is the explanation. The westward movement of Roma communities away from the Ottoman world and into Western Europe was happening simultaneously with the development of slavery in Wallachia and Moldavia, and the reception Roma received in the West was initially strikingly different. The first documented Roma arrivals in Western European cities in the early 15th century were greeted with something that, from the perspective of what came afterward, looks startlingly like hospitality. The year 1417 offers one of the most concrete early snapshots. A group of Roma arrived in Hamburg presenting themselves as pilgrims and carrying letters of safe conduct signed by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund. Similar groups appeared in other German cities, in the Low Countries, in France, and in Switzerland around the same period, carrying letters from various imperial, papal, and royal authorities that described them as Christian pilgrims performing penance for the sins of their ancestors, who had supposedly apostatized under pressure and required their descendants to wander for 7 years as expiation. This story, the penitent pilgrimage narrative, was apparently plausible enough that city authorities in multiple countries accepted it and provided the arriving groups with food, accommodation, and small gifts of money. Some cities went further, providing formal letters of welcome and safe conduct to help the travellers move through their territories without harassment. The story was, to put it charitably, a work of creative biography rather than literal autobiography. But it was a strategically intelligent piece of social navigation. Medieval Western European society understood pilgrimage as a legitimate social institution with clear rules. Pilgrims had rights to hospitality and protection, were generally exempt from certain tolls and requirements, and were understood to be performing a holy act that the surrounding community was obligated to support. By presenting themselves as pilgrims, Roma community leaders were claiming a category that their audience understood and respected, and their audience, not yet having developed the reflexive suspicion that would characterize later European responses, was initially inclined to take the claim at face value. The letters of safe conduct were real documents, which added considerable credibility to the presentation. How exactly Roma community leaders obtained letters from figures as significant as Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund is a question historians have found genuinely interesting. One persuasive theory is that Sigismund, who was enthusiastically interested in projecting his authority across the broad territories where his influence was contested, found it useful to issue such letters to communities that would travel widely and demonstrate the reach of his protection. The letters were both genuine acts of imperial patronage and political advertisements for Sigismund's authority, which aligned well enough with Roma communities' need for documentation that the transaction was mutually beneficial. The welcome did not last. Over the course of the 15th century, as the initial novelty wore off and Roma communities established more permanent presences in Western European territories, the reception shifted from cautious hospitality to active hostility with a speed that, in retrospect, reflects how fragile the initial welcome had always been. The change was driven by several converging factors, none of which had anything particularly to do with Roma behaviour, and all of which had to do with European anxieties that needed a target. The late 15th and 16th centuries were periods of significant social disruption in Western Europe. Population growth was straining agricultural systems, enclosures were displacing rural populations, religious upheaval was undermining institutional stability, and the established social order was under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. In this context, visibly mobile communities that did not fit into the settled, parish-organised social structure were easy to designate as threats. The fact that Roma communities had been welcomed as pilgrims a few decades earlier was simply forgotten or reinterpreted. If they were truly pilgrims performing penance, why hadn't they gone home by now? The 7-year pilgrimage story, which had been accepted when the travellers were new, became evidence of deception once European authorities had decided Roma were undesirable. The legal response was swift and increasingly severe. England's first statute specifically targeting Roma, issued in 1530 under Henry VIII, ordered all Egyptians, the English term, to leave the country within 16 days or face imprisonment and confiscation of their goods. Spain issued expulsion orders in 1499 under Ferdinand and Isabella, ordering Roma to settle and take up recognised trades or leave the country, with increasingly savage penalties for non-compliance ratcheting up through the 16th century. France issued multiple expulsion orders throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. German principalities competed to produce the most comprehensive legislation, with some territories specifying that Roma who returned after expulsion could be executed without trial. The reasoning offered for these laws is instructive. The accusations levelled at Roma in legislative preambles and official proclamations included spying for the Ottomans, which was convenient given ongoing Ottoman-European conflict and required no evidence, practising witchcraft, which was a charge that could be applied to any community whose practices were unfamiliar, theft, which was both a general accusation and a specific consequence of policies that denied Roma communities access to legitimate employment while simultaneously prohibiting begging, and simply being foreign and mobile, which was increasingly treated as a crime category in itself, as European states developed more sophisticated mechanisms for surveilling and controlling their populations. The Ottoman spy accusation deserves a moment's attention because of how revealing it is about the logic of persecution. Roma communities had come from the East, spoke a language nobody understood, maintained connections, real or imagined, with territories under Ottoman control, and travelled in ways that made them difficult to monitor. In an era of genuine Ottoman-European military conflict, a sedentary, parish-organised European society was genuinely anxious about information security in ways that were not entirely irrational. What was irrational was the application of that anxiety to an entire ethnic group on the basis of geography of origin, without any actual evidence of espionage. The accusation was a projection of anxiety onto a convenient target, not an assessment of evidence. This pattern, a society under pressure identifying a mobile, marginal community as the source of its problems, repeats throughout European history with depressing consistency. The English 1530 statute escalated in 1554 under Mary I to specify hanging as the penalty for Roma presence in England, revised slightly to allow exemption for those who had been born in England or lived there for at least 5 years. This revision introduced a domestic-born Roma population to the legal calculus, since Roma people who were born in England could not meaningfully be expelled from it, creating a category of legal limbo that subsequent legislation attempted to resolve with increasing incoherence. The Egyptians Act of 1562, under Elizabeth I, extended the death penalty to non-Roma people who associated with Roma for longer than a month, which was an innovative approach to ethnic cleansing. If you could not eliminate the target group directly, you could eliminate everyone willing to shelter or trade with them. It was, all things considered, not exactly England's finest legislative hour. Spain's approach evolved from expulsion orders into something more specifically designed to destroy Roma cultural identity while retaining Roma labour. The Pragmatica of 1633, issued under Philip IV, prohibited the use of the Romani language, Roma dress, and Roma customs, ordered Roma to settle in specific approved towns, and banned them from working as horse traders, which was one of the primary legitimate economic activities available to them. The logic was the logic of forced assimilation. If you could not expel the people, you could at least destroy the culture, and a people without their culture would eventually cease to be a distinct people at all. This reasoning, which appears benign to those who deploy it and is anything but to those it targets, would recur in Roma policy across multiple countries and multiple centuries. The Spanish Pragmatica of 1633 was not enforced with complete consistency. Enforcement was the chronic weakness of Spanish anti-Roma legislation, which tended to be severe on paper and episodic in practice, but it established a legal framework that culminated in the most dramatic single anti-Roma action in Western European history before the 20th century. The Gran Redada of 1749, the Great Raid, was a coordinated operation planned in secret over several years by King Ferdinand VI and his minister, the Marquis of Ensenada, and executed in a single night across the entire Spanish territory. On July 30th, 1749, officials across Spain simultaneously arrested Roma men, women and children in what was intended to be a comprehensive roundup of the entire Roma population of the country. The operation captured somewhere between 9,000 and 12,000 people, depending on which source you consult, and the discrepancy itself tells you something about the quality of record-keeping for a population that the state considered expendable. Men were sent to forced labour in mines and naval arsenals. Women and children were confined in workhouses and institutions. Families were deliberately separated, the separation being understood as a mechanism for preventing Roma communities from reconstituting themselves once the imprisoned generation was eventually released. The plan, as conceived by Ensenada, was essentially to make Roma culture in Spain extinct within a generation by preventing the transmission of language, customs, and social structure from parents to children. The execution of this plan was, by the standards of its own objectives, a failure. The operation was poorly coordinated, many Roma evaded arrest, protests from various quarters, including some Spanish nobles who objected to the seizure of their employees, created administrative complications, and within a few years the imprisoned population had largely been released, partly because the naval arsenals and mines had not actually been designed to absorb and productively employ thousands of additional forced labourers, and the resulting chaos was worse than the status quo ante. By 1763, most of the imprisoned Roma had been released. They returned to their communities, which had not ceased to exist. The Gran Redada was, in its own terms, a spectacular and expensive failure. What it succeeded in doing was demonstrating the principle that Roma communities could be subjected to state violence on a mass scale, with minimal legal or moral consequences for the people responsible. Nobody was prosecuted for the Gran Redada. Nobody apologized for it. The officials responsible were rewarded rather than punished. The lesson this taught, both to European states that observed it and to Roma communities that experienced it, was a lesson about the limits of protection available to minority communities that lack political representation, legal standing, and allies in positions of power. It was a lesson that would be applied on an incomparably larger scale 2 centuries later. The deportation of Roma to European colonies in the Americas is a chapter of this story that receives even less attention than the Gran Redada. Despite involving tens of thousands of people over several centuries, Portugal was among the first European powers to use colonial deportation as a mechanism for dealing with unwanted domestic populations, and Roma were among the first populations targeted. From the 1530s onward, Portuguese authorities deported Roma and others deemed criminally or socially undesirable to Brazil, Angola, and other colonial territories, initially as a form of punishment, and later as a way of populating colonies that needed labour and settlers. The Roma who arrived in Brazil in this manner did not choose to come. They were transported by force, typically in conditions that were neither comfortable nor particularly concerned with their survival. The French deported Roma to Louisiana and the Caribbean. The British deported Roma under the same legal frameworks that transported common criminals to the American colonies and later to Australia. By the late 17th century, Roma transportation to the New World had become an established, if not particularly systematically administered practice in several European countries simultaneously. The communities that resulted from these forced migrations are the ancestors of Roma populations in Brazil, in Louisiana, and elsewhere in the Americas. populations that are almost entirely invisible in standard histories of the Americas, despite their presence going back to the earliest European colonial period. The transformation of Roma from welcome pilgrims to hunted criminals in Western European legal and public consciousness over the course of roughly a century is one of the more swift and comprehensive examples of ethnic scapegoating in European history. It required no change in Roma behaviour. It required only a change in European circumstances, growing demographic pressure, religious conflict, economic disruption, state formation processes that valued legibility and sedentariness, and the identification of a mobile, visible, and politically powerless minority as a convenient explanation for the resulting anxieties. The machinery of persecution, once built, proved remarkably durable. The laws remained on the books, the assumptions remained in the culture, and the Roma remained exactly where they had always been, navigating a world organised against them and surviving it anyway. In August of 1944, in a section of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp known as the Zigeuner Lager, the Gypsy family camp, approximately 4,000 Roma men, women and children were murdered in a single night. They had been living in this section of the camp since February 1943, kept together as family units in what the SS administration designated as a special enclosure, separated from the other prisoner populations. Earlier in 1944, camp authorities had attempted to liquidate the section and met unexpected resistance. The Roma prisoners, having learned what was coming, had obtained makeshift weapons and barricaded themselves inside the barracks, forcing the SS to withdraw. The resistance bought time, not enough time. On the night of August 2nd and into the early hours of August 3rd, the SS returned in force, and by morning the Zigeuner Lager was empty. The Roma word for what happened to their people between roughly 1935 and 1945 is parajmos, pronounced approximately pouriemos, a Romani word meaning the devouring, or sometimes translated as the destruction. Some Roma communities use the alternative term samudaripan, meaning all killing. Both words are attempts to name something that happened to between 220,000 and 1.5 million people, the uncertainty of that range itself being a consequence of the genocide, since communities that are systematically destroyed do not always leave the records that would allow precise accounting afterward, that the parajmos is not a household term in the way that the Holocaust is, that most people who learn about this period in school learn almost nothing about the Roma dimension of Nazi racial policy, and that the Berlin Memorial to Roma victims of National Socialism was not inaugurated until 2012, 67 years after the end of the war, are not coincidences. They are the product of specific decisions, made repeatedly over the post-war decades, about whose suffering was officially recognised, whose community representatives were invited to bear witness in legal and political proceedings, and whose dead were deemed worthy of institutional commemoration. The invisibility of the parajmos in mainstream historical consciousness is itself a continuation of the persecution. By other means, the legal architecture that enabled the genocide began not in the camps, but in the courtrooms and administrative offices of the early Nazi period. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 were publicly framed as legislation concerning the relationship between Germans and Jews, and that framing has dominated how the laws are remembered. But the implementing regulations that followed the laws explicitly named three groups as racially distinct from Germans, and therefore subject to the new racial order: Jews, people of African heritage, and Roma. The racial theorists of the Nazi state had developed an extensive pseudoscientific apparatus for categorizing Roma as racially dangerous, building on research that had been underway in various German institutions since the early 20th century. The racial science applied to Roma was, if anything, more elaborate in its pseudoscientific framework than what was applied to Jews, partly because Roma presented a more complicated classificatory challenge. Jewish heritage was defined through religious community records, which were bureaucratically tractable. Roma heritage was harder to document through official records because Roma communities had historically maintained limited engagement with the official record-keeping systems of the states they lived in. The German racial hygiene bureaucracy therefore developed its own methods, including a unit called the Racial Hygiene and Population Biology Research Center, established in 1936 under the direction of Robert Ritter, which undertook a systematic program of interviewing and genealogically documenting Roma individuals and families across Germany and Austria. Ritter's unit produced detailed racial genealogies of approximately 30,000 Roma individuals, classifying each person according to their degree of Roma ancestry and their alleged degree of social dangerousness, which in the racial hygiene framework were considered directly correlated. The unit's work was considered academic research. Ritter himself held a university position and published scholarly papers on Roma genetics and criminology. The research was used directly to determine who would be subject to forced sterilization, who would be arrested, and who would be deported to concentration camps. The distance between the university office and the gas chamber in this case was measured in administrative paperwork. The measures against Roma escalated in stages throughout the late 1930s, following a pattern of legislative exclusion, forced registration, economic prohibition, and physical concentration that parallels what was being done to Jewish communities simultaneously, but has received far less documentation and analysis in post-war scholarship. In 1936, Roma in Germany were subject to a census and required to register with local police. In 1938, Heinrich Himmler issued a decree titled The Fight Against the Gypsy Plague, which ordered the systematic registration of all Roma in Germany and established the framework for determining who qualified as Roma under racial definitions. By 1939, mass arrests were underway, with Roma being sent to concentration camps across Germany as part of what the administration described as social cleansing. The deportations to Poland began in 1940, initially as part of a broader program of removing populations that the Nazi racial planners considered undesirable from German territory into the occupied East. Roma from Austria were among the first groups deported to the Lodz ghetto, where approximately 5,000 people were held in conditions of extreme deprivation before being transferred to the Chelmno extermination facility in 1942. The Chelmno killings represented the first systematic use of gas vans against Roma, a mobile killing technology that predated the construction of the permanent gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau and that killed approximately 5,000 Roma in a matter of weeks. The conditions inside the Zigeunerlager were catastrophic from the outset. This was not humanitarian. It was partly a reflection of ongoing uncertainty within the SS administration about how to classify Roma prisoners, some of whom had served in the German military, and partly an administrative arrangement that made the subsequent liquidation of the entire section easier when the decision was finally made. The conditions in the Zigeunerlager during its existence were catastrophic. Disease, specifically a condition called noma, a gangrenous facial infection that was extremely rare outside of severely malnourished and immunocompromised populations, spread through the camp in ways that horrified even the prisoner physicians who documented it. Josef Mengele, the SS physician whose name became synonymous with grotesque medical experiments at Auschwitz, was assigned to the Zigeunerlager for a period and conducted experiments on Roma prisoners, including children, with the same contemptuous curiosity he applied to other prisoner populations and the same complete indifference to their welfare or survival. The resistance of August 2nd is worth dwelling on, because it complicates the standard narrative of helpless victimhood that genocide histories sometimes unintentionally reinforce. The Roma prisoners who barricaded themselves in their barracks had received information that the liquidation was imminent. Accounts suggest that some non-Roma prisoners passed warnings through the camp's informal communication networks, and they responded not with passive acceptance, but with whatever means of resistance were available. The SS did not expect this and were unprepared for it, which is why the first attempt to liquidate the section failed. The prisoners bought themselves several months. They knew, with considerable clarity, that they were buying time rather than survival, and they chose to resist anyway. That choice is worth remembering alongside the outcome. Estimates of the total Roma death toll range enormously, and the range itself is significant. The low estimate of approximately 220,000 comes primarily from post-war German documentation, records of deportation and camp registration. The problem with this methodology is that it counts only the people who passed through the documented parts of the system. The Roma who were shot in fields and forests by mobile killing units, the Roma who died in village roundups that were never formally documented, the Roma communities that were simply eliminated in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, without anyone recording the elimination in writing. These deaths are not captured in the documentation-based estimates. The high estimates, ranging up to 1.5 million, are based on demographic analysis, comparing pre-war population estimates of Roma in various countries with post-war population counts and estimating the gap. This methodology has its own problems. Pre-war population counts of Roma were themselves unreliable, but it captures losses that the documentation-based approach misses entirely. The scholarly consensus today tends toward figures in the range of 500,000 to over 1 million. For comparison, the pre-war Roma population of Europe is estimated at around 1 to 1.5 million people. By any reasonable estimate, between a third and two-thirds of European Roma were killed. Countries that are rarely the focus of Holocaust discussions in Western education contributed substantially to Roma deaths. Romania, which, as the previous chapter described, had its own long history of Roma enslavement, allied itself with Nazi Germany and participated actively in the persecution of its Roma population. Romanian authorities deported tens of thousands of Roma to Transnistria, a territory under Romanian administration in occupied Ukraine, where they were held in conditions that killed large numbers through starvation, disease, and direct violence. Croatia's wartime Ustasha regime killed Roma in camps and in mass shootings as part of its own genocide. Hungary deported Roma alongside Jewish citizens in the final stages of the war. The geography of Roma victimhood extended across the entire European continent. The post-war reckoning, or rather the systematic failure of post-war reckoning, is where the story of the Parajmos becomes entangled with questions about justice, memory, and recognition that remain unresolved. The Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 1946 prosecuted a selection of the major surviving Nazi war criminals and established important legal precedents about crimes against humanity and genocide. Roma were not represented among the witnesses and survivors who gave testimony at Nuremberg, not because no Roma had survived to testify, they had, but because the structure of the trials centered on communities and organizations that had formal institutional representation, and Roma communities had none. They were victims whose victimhood was not, at Nuremberg, officially part of the story being told. The West German government's post-war reparations program initially excluded Roma almost entirely. The legal reasoning held that Roma had been persecuted not for racial reasons but for criminal and social ones, a direct repetition of Nazi racial ideology deployed by the government of post-war democratic Germany to avoid paying compensation to the survivors of that ideology. Several of his research assistants also resumed their careers without interruption. The post-war German legal system managed to reintegrate the people who had built the bureaucratic machinery of Roma persecution, while simultaneously denying that the persecution had been racial in character. This required a degree of institutional cognitive dissonance that apparently did not trouble anyone responsible for the decisions. The Federal Republic of Germany did not formally recognize the genocide against Roma until 1982, when Chancellor Helmut Schmidt made a statement acknowledging that Roma had been persecuted on racial grounds. West Germany's Central Council of Sinti and Roma, founded in 1982 to advocate for official recognition, had been campaigning for this acknowledgement for years. It came 37 years after the end of the war. Compensation programs were expanded after this recognition, but the delays had meant that many survivors had died without receiving anything. The memorial in Berlin's Tiergarten was proposed and debated for decades before completion. Arguments about its design, location, budget, and political implications continued through the 1990s and into the 2000s, with various parties raising objections that reflected, at least in part, a basic unwillingness to allocate a prominent central location to a community that still occupied a marginal social position in Germany and across Europe. The memorial was inaugurated on October 24, 2012, in the presence of Chancellor Angela Merkel and Roma representatives from across Europe. It is a circular reflecting pool with a fresh flower placed in the centre, changed daily, ringed by inscriptions in Romani, German and English. It is beautiful, and it exists, and it took 67 years. The Parajmos sits at the intersection of two histories, the history of the Nazi genocide, which has been extensively documented and debated, and the history of Roma marginalization in Europe, which has been much less so. What the Nazi period added to Roma history was not the invention of anti-Roma persecution, as the previous chapters have established that was centuries old, but its systematic industrial intensification to a point of attempted extermination. And what the post-war period revealed was that the structures of anti-Roma prejudice were resilient enough to survive the defeat of the regime that had carried those prejudices to their extreme conclusion. The genocide was eventually recognized. The prejudice that enabled it continued in subtler forms into the present. The story of Roma in the Americas begins considerably earlier than most Americans or Brazilians would guess, and it begins, appropriately enough, with a story that involves disputed documentation and historical ambiguity. which is by now a familiar register for Roma history. The claim that Roma were present on Columbus's third voyage of 1498 rests on a single name in the crew manifest, a man recorded as Pedro de Torres, described in some accounts as a converted gypsy, and historians are reasonably cautious about building large conclusions on a single ambiguous name. What is considerably better documented is the systematic deportation of Roma from Portugal to Brazil beginning in 1538. The Roma who arrived in Brazil in this manner were not volunteers. They were transported as convicts or undesirables, put on ships to a territory most of them had never heard of, and set ashore in a colonial environment that was dangerous, economically chaotic, and radically unlike anything they had previously encountered. Some died quickly. Some survived and built communities. Some were absorbed into the extraordinarily complex ethnic mixing that characterized colonial Brazilian society from its earliest decades. The Roma who arrived in Brazil in the 16th century encountered indigenous populations, enslaved Africans, Portuguese colonists, and people of every combination of these backgrounds, and the interactions that resulted produced cultural hybridity that resists neat categorization. Brazilian Roma communities today, variously called ciganos, using the Portuguese cognate of the word that appears in Spanish gitano and English gypsy, number in the hundreds of thousands, with some estimates placing the population at 800,000 and others going considerably higher. The variance reflects the same difficulty that characterizes Roma population counting everywhere. Community members who have experienced the practical consequences of being identified as Roma have rational incentives to avoid identification on official forms, and census methodologies that rely on self-identification systematically undercount populations with those incentives. Brazilian Roma maintain distinct cultural communities, speak varieties of Romani influenced by 4 centuries of Portuguese contact, and practice traditions that show the extraordinary layering of influences: Indian roots, Portuguese colonial overlay, African contact, Brazilian Catholic religious environment, and the specific character that developed from being a minority within a society that was itself already a radical mixture. The formation of Roma communities in Louisiana involves French colonial deportation policy, the specific social environment of the Gulf Coast colonies, and interactions with African and African-descended communities that produce something genuinely distinctive. France deported Roma to Louisiana in several waves during the 18th century, the same period when France was also transporting enslaved Africans to the same territory. The specific social geography of French colonial Louisiana, a slave society with a relatively large free population of colour, a Catholic religious culture, and a frontier environment where European social hierarchies were somewhat more fluid than at home, created conditions in which Roma and African-descended communities came into sustained contact in ways that shaped both. The community that emerged from this contact was sometimes called Black Dutch in historical documents, a label that obscured rather than illuminated its actual character. It maintained elements of Roma cultural practice while absorbing African musical traditions, religious practices, and social customs. Scholars have identified structural parallels between Roma musical practices and the earliest documented forms of what would eventually develop into jazz and blues. The specific modal approaches, the relationship between performer and audience, the emphasis on improvisation and emotional intensity. Making direct causal claims about musical origins is always risky, but the presence of Roma musicians in the Mississippi Delta region from the 18th century onward is not trivial context for understanding where those musical traditions came from. The scales, the ornamentation, the emotional register, these have family resemblances to Roma musical practice that ethnomusicologists have been noting carefully for decades. The largest single wave of Roma immigration to the United States came in the second half of the 19th century, directly following the emancipation of enslaved Roma in Wallachia and Moldavia. Communities released from slavery in Romania in the 1850s and 1860s had no land, no capital, and no established position in Romanian society. They faced persistent discrimination and poverty in a country that had just legally redefined them from property to people, but had not provided any material means to function as free citizens. The United States, simultaneously experiencing massive immigration from Eastern Europe generally, represented an opportunity, and thousands of Roma took it. The Roma who arrived through Ellis Island in this period came documented as Romanian, Hungarian, or Austrian, depending on which empire's territory they had most recently passed through. Some were assigned surnames by immigration officials who needed something to write and found Roma naming conventions incompatible with their forms. The Roma who became Americans in this period generally arrived with the intention of practicing the same occupations that had supported their communities in Europe. Metalwork, horse trading, music, and craft-based activities found markets in the rapidly industrializing American economy of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some families settled, others maintained circuits across regions. The pattern was, by this point, deeply familiar. The approximately 1 million Roma currently estimated to be living in the United States, a figure subject to all the usual uncertainties about self-identification, in a community with reasons for caution, are largely invisible in American public consciousness. This invisibility has several sources. Roma cultural disposition toward community privacy and internal self-sufficiency is one. The absence of a single clear racial category in the American system where Roma fit is another. Depending on family history and the inclinations of whoever is doing the classifying, individual Roma Americans may be categorized as white, Hispanic, or other, with Roma identity disappearing into whatever broader category absorbs it. And the successful assimilation of some Roma families over multiple generations means that later generations may not identify as Roma at all, the heritage present in family traditions without being named. The Roma communities visibly present in American cities, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in New York, in Houston, attract the same combination of curiosity and suspicion that Roma communities attracted in 15th century Western Europe. The specific accusations have modernized: fortune-telling fraud rather than witchcraft, benefit program misuse rather than Ottoman espionage. But the structural dynamic is recognizable across 500 years. A community that maintains its own social systems, resolves disputes internally, and prioritizes collective solidarity over legibility to outside institutions will always generate anxiety in states that prefer transparent, individually documented, readily taxable citizens. The anxiety says more about the states than about the community. Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and other Latin American nations have Roma populations with histories rooted in European deportation and voluntary migration, each shaped by the specific colonial and post-colonial environment it developed within. Australia has Roma communities descended from transportation of convicted persons in the British colonial period. South Africa has small Roma communities. The global diaspora extends to wherever European colonialism and migration reached. What is striking about Roma communities across this diaspora, from Brazil to Louisiana to Chicago to Sydney, is how the core cultural elements have persisted across wildly different environments. The Romani language, in various states of preservation and mixture, still connects diaspora communities to each other and to the European base. The social organization, the extended family networks, the practices around marriage and community decisions, the internal authority structures, is recognizable across vastly different geographical contexts. The musical traditions, filtered through whatever local musical environment each community developed within, still carry the emotional signature of something very old. The Parajmos created an additional dimension to this diaspora story that is rarely discussed. The genocide killed a disproportionate number of the people who held the most complete versions of the community's cultural knowledge. Elders, community leaders, the carriers of tradition who had not had occasion to migrate to the Americas before the war. These were precisely the people most likely to be in Europe in the 1940s, and they died in numbers that represented a genuine cultural catastrophe alongside the human one. The communities that survived in Europe emerged from the war with their social fabric damaged in ways that took generations to begin repairing. The diaspora communities in the Americas, ironically, sometimes preserved cultural elements that the genocide had destroyed in their European homeland. The distance that had made them peripheral suddenly made them archives. The history of Roma in the Americas is a history of a people making something out of conditions that were not designed for them and frequently designed against them. The deportees who arrived in Brazil in 1538 did not choose to come. The immigrants who arrived at Ellis Island in 1880 chose to come, but from conditions that left them little meaningful alternative. In both cases, they built communities, maintained traditions, preserved language, and raised children who were Roma in continents where nobody had previously been Roma. That this is a minor miracle is made invisible by the fact that it happened quietly, without ceremony, in households and conversations and the daily practice of being who you are when the world around you would prefer you to be someone else. the American Roma story also intersects with the broader question of how diasporic communities maintain identity across generations when the pressures of assimilation are significant and sustained. The United States, whatever its stated ideology of multicultural coexistence, historically applied substantial pressure on immigrant communities to assimilate into a broadly defined American mainstream, to adopt English, to acquire American citizenship, to participate in American civic life in ways that required setting aside certain elements of the heritage community's distinctive practices. Roma communities navigated this pressure with the same dual-register approach they had developed over centuries in Europe, performing sufficient Americanness to function in the broader society while maintaining internal Roma identity in household and community contexts. The result, across several generations, has been enormous variation. Some Roma families in the United States have maintained robust community identity, Romani language use, and traditional social structures into the third and fourth American-born generation. Others have assimilated to a degree that their Roma heritage is known within the family, but not particularly operative in daily life. Still others occupy various points along that spectrum, with identity more or less salient depending on context. The community is not monolithic, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it, and also the thing most often misunderstood by outsiders who encounter Roma in one context and assume that context represents the whole. The political invisibility of Roma communities in the United States. They have no established advocacy organizations with the profile of comparable minority community organizations, no consistent political representation, no significant presence in mainstream media representations of American ethnic diversity, means that Roma-specific issues rarely appear on political agendas. Housing discrimination, employment discrimination, educational exclusion. The specific challenges facing Roma communities in the United States are documented by researchers, but largely absent from public debate. The community is, in the most literal sense, not counted. This invisibility has a paradox at its core. Roma have been in the Americas since the earliest decades of European colonial presence. They have been in the United States since before it was the United States. Their contributions to American culture, in music, in craft traditions, in the economic activities of frontier and industrial America, are real and documentable. And yet the community remains, to most Americans, either invisible or understood only through the lens of European stereotypes that have little relevance to the actual lives of people who have been American for 5 or 6 generations. The gap between the reality of Roma presence in America and the public's awareness of it is one of the more striking examples of selective historical memory in a country that has plenty of them. What connects the Roma in Louisiana to the Roma in Bucharest to the Roma in Mumbai, or rather to the ancestors who left the region of Mumbai's eventual location more than 1,000 years ago, is not territory, not a state, not a common political project, and not a shared religious practice. It is the accumulated weight of a shared story, carried in language and music and social custom and family memory, across distances and durations that most human communities have not been asked to sustain. The road that began somewhere in Rajasthan or Punjab, passed through Persia and the Caucasus and Byzantium and the Balkans and the Romanian principalities and Western Europe and the Atlantic, is still going. It goes wherever Roma communities have gone, which is more places than any map designed to show nations and their borders is equipped to represent. The recognition of the Prajmos, incomplete and delayed as it has been, is part of a broader question about how European societies account for their treatment of Roma communities across centuries. The Berlin Memorial represents official acknowledgement that something was done that should not have been done. It does not, by itself, address the structural conditions that made Roma communities vulnerable to that treatment in the first place, or that continue to make Roma communities vulnerable to discrimination, exclusion, and violence in contemporary Europe. Recognition is a beginning, not a conclusion. The flower in the reflecting pool is changed every day, which is the right instinct. Memory of this kind requires daily renewal, not a one-time ceremony and a plaque. Understanding Roma history from the outside, through the lens of persecution, deportation, genocide, and diaspora, tends to produce a picture of a people perpetually acted upon by larger forces, a community defined by what was done to it rather than by how it organized itself. That picture is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, because while all of those things were happening outside, something else was happening inside. A complex, internally coherent social world with its own architecture, its own logic, and its own mechanisms for maintaining order and transmitting culture, that functioned independently of whatever empire or nation-state happened to be surrounding it at the time. Most people outside Roma communities have never seen this world, which is partly by design and partly by mutual indifference. It is, however, one of the more sophisticated examples of minority community self-organization in human history, and it deserves considerably more attention than it usually receives. The first thing to understand about the internal world of Roma communities is that Roma is not a monolithic category. It never was. The communities that European sources lump together under various names, Gypsies, Egyptians, Zigeuner, Tziganes, were always internally differentiated into groups with distinct identities, distinct dialects, distinct occupational traditions, and distinct histories. The shared Indian origin, the shared broad cultural framework, and the shared experience of marginalization in European societies created real common ground. But the specific communities that emerged from the long migration were not identical to each other, and they knew it, and they cared about the distinction. The major subgroups recognized by scholars and by Roma communities themselves include the Roma proper, using the word in its narrower sense to refer to communities whose ancestors were primarily in the Eastern Balkans and whose history includes the Romanian slavery period, the Sinti, the Kale, and the Romanical, along with many smaller regional groups. Each of these categories encompasses further internal diversity, so that speaking of the Sinti as a single unified group is almost as much of an oversimplification as speaking of Roma as a single unified group. What these categories represent is not strict ethnic division, but clusters of shared history, shared dialect, and shared cultural practice that make communities within a cluster more immediately intelligible to each other than they are to communities in other clusters. The Sinti, also spelled Sinte in some traditions, are the communities historically associated with German-speaking Central Europe, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and northern Italy. They arrived in this region earlier than some other groups, and had 5 or 6 centuries to develop the specific cultural character shaped by interaction with German-speaking urban and rural society. Sinti communities produced a disproportionate number of the prominent musicians that non-Roma Europeans associate with Roma culture. The jazz violinist Django Reinhardt, who is probably the most famous Roma musician in the Western cultural canon, was Sinti. Sinti Romani, the dialect spoken within these communities, is distinct from other Romani varieties but immediately recognizable to speakers of other dialects as belonging to the same family, in something like the way that Dutch and German are distinct but mutually intelligible with effort. The Kale, the word means black in Romani, from the same Sanskrit root that gave us Kali, are the communities associated with the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal primarily, with significant communities in Finland where a separate Kale tradition developed under distinct circumstances. Spanish Kale, sometimes called Gitanos, are the communities most directly associated with flamenco, both its creation and its continued practice as a living tradition rather than a museum piece. The Kale have been in Spain since the 15th century and have been more deeply integrated into the cultural fabric of the Iberian Peninsula than most non-Spaniards realize, to the point where the line between Gitano cultural influence and broader Spanish cultural tradition is genuinely difficult to draw in music, in certain religious practices, and in aspects of vernacular Spanish language. Caló, the mixed language of Spanish Kale that blends Romani vocabulary with Spanish grammar, has contributed hundreds of words to Spanish slang that Spanish speakers use without awareness of their Romani origin. The Romanishal are the Roma communities of the British Isles, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, who arrived in Britain in the early 16th century and developed their distinctive cultural tradition in interaction with British society over 500 years. Anglo-Romani, the variety of Romani used in Britain, is the most heavily mixed of the major Romani varieties, to the point where linguists debate whether it qualifies as a separate language or as a form of English with Romani lexical overlay. Romanical communities in Britain were sufficiently assimilated into certain aspects of British working-class culture, particularly horse trading and fairground work, that their Roma identity was sometimes invisible to outsiders, even as it remained central to internal community life. Each of these major groups, and the dozens of smaller groups that complete the picture, developed specific occupational specializations that became associated with community identity. Roma communities in the Romanian tradition produced notable musicians, metalworkers, and bear trainers. Sinti communities were particularly associated with music, and with specific craft traditions in Central European contexts. Kale communities became central to the horse fair circuit that was a major institution of rural British economic life until the mid-20th century, and their expertise in horses and horse trading was considered the best available in Britain for centuries, which is the kind of professional reputation that takes generations of genuine excellence to build and that sticks in collective memory long after the specific economic context has changed. These occupational specializations were not accidental. They were the product of deliberate transmission across generations, of apprenticeship systems within families and extended kin networks, of community investment in specific knowledge bases that represented the community's economic competitive advantage. A community whose reputation for horse expertise was established over generations had a strong incentive to maintain that reputation through genuine quality, because the reputation was the economic foundation. The knowledge was therefore protected, shared within the community, taught to children as a matter of course, but not casually shared with outsiders who might compete. This brings us to the Compagni system, the clan structure that provides the organising framework for Roma social life at a level above the immediate family. The Campania, singular, is the extended network of related families that functions as the basic unit of Roma communal organisation. It is larger than a household but smaller than the entire community, typically encompassing between a handful and a few dozen related families who share economic activities, make collective decisions about movement and settlement, and provide mutual support in ways that a single family could not sustain independently. The Campania is not a formal institution with written rules and elected officers, at least not typically. It is a social network organised around kinship, sustained by shared economic interest, and governed by informal authority structures in which age, personal reputation, and demonstrated wisdom carry more weight than formal titles. The figure who leads a Campania, often called the Rom Baro, the big man, though specific titles vary across communities, holds authority that is consensual rather than coercive. He leads because people respect his judgment, and when they stop respecting it, they stop following, which is a form of accountability that formal democratic systems might note with interest. The economic logic of the Campania is elegant. Individual families are economically vulnerable in ways that a network is not. A single family of Smiths can be driven out of a territory by a hostile official, or wiped out by illness, or have a run of bad luck with trade. A Campania of 20 related Smith families spread across a region can absorb individual misfortunes, support members who are temporarily unable to work, and maintain the community's economic presence even when individual components are struggling. The Campania is, in essence, a mutual insurance system organised around kinship, which was more reliable than any external insurance institution available to communities that had good reason to distrust external institutions. The marriage practices associated with Roma communities, endogamy, the preference for marriage within the community rather than outside it, served multiple functions simultaneously. At the level of cultural preservation, endogamy meant that children grew up in households where both parents were Roma, both parents spoke Romani, both parents practiced Roma customs, and both parents had absorbed the community's values and knowledge. Exogamous marriage, marriage outside the community, risked cultural dilution, as the children of mixed marriages would be raised in households where Roma culture competed with the culture of the non-Roma partner's family. Over generations, exogamy tends to accelerate assimilation. Endogamy tends to slow it. At the level of social organisation, endogamy maintained the integrity of the Campania by keeping economic relationships and social obligations within the network. Marriage between families was not just a personal matter, it was an economic and social alliance that tied the families together in webs of mutual obligation that extended through the next generation. A marriage negotiated between two Campania families was an investment in long-term community cohesion as much as it was an event in the lives of the individuals involved. The process of marriage negotiation in traditional Roma communities was considerably more elaborate than the Western Romantic model might suggest, and considerably more honest about what marriage actually involved at the community level. Families negotiated on behalf of their children with an explicitness about economic considerations, family reputation, and community alignment that modern Western cultures tend to find either pragmatic or uncomfortable, depending on their assumptions. The negotiations could involve extended discussions between family representatives, the exchange of gifts or payments, and formal agreements about how the new household would be organised and which Campania it would affiliate with. The young people concerned were not necessarily absent from this process. Roma courtship traditions varied considerably across communities and periods, but the decision was understood as a family and community matter, not solely an individual one. The Mariam system, which was introduced in the chapter on Roma spiritual life, operates as the practical daily framework of Roma cultural life in ways that extend well beyond the ritual dimension. In the context of daily household organization, Mariam creates a highly specific set of protocols about what goes where, what can be combined, and what must be kept separate. These protocols are not arbitrary, and they are not simply the external expression of spiritual beliefs. They have functional hygienic logic that would have been meaningful in any pre-modern context, and that remains meaningful in contexts where public health infrastructure is unreliable. Communities that practiced rigorous separation of clean and unclean, that had clear protocols for handling potentially contaminated materials, and that enforced these protocols through social sanctions and spiritual frameworks, were communities that were doing something genuinely protective, even if the framework they were using to justify the protocols was spiritual rather than bacteriological. The outcomes are similar regardless of the theoretical framework. You get sick less often. The social dimension of Mariam, the regulation of contact with Gadjo, with non-Roma people and things, is where the system has generated the most misunderstanding from outside observers. The word Gadjo, meaning non-Roma, carries implications in Roma usage that often get flattened in translation. It does not simply mean stranger or outsider in a hostile sense. It means, more precisely, someone who operates outside the Mariam system, someone whose purity status is unknown, and therefore requires caution in interaction. A Roma person living and working among Gadjo is not necessarily in constant anxiety about contamination. The practical rules are negotiated and adapted to specific circumstances, but the underlying framework, the understanding that the Roma community has its own system of purity, and that interactions with those outside it require specific management, shapes daily life in ways that create observable behavioral patterns that outsiders have historically interpreted as aloofness, secretiveness, or hostility, without understanding what they were actually observing. The Kris, the traditional Roma court of justice, deserves extended attention, because it is both one of the most sophisticated elements of Roma self-governance and one of the least understood outside the community. The Kris is a deliberative assembly convened to resolve disputes that cannot be resolved through informal negotiation between the affected parties. It typically involves a panel of respected community members, senior men and women whose judgment is trusted, who hear testimony, examine evidence, and arrive at a decision through a process of collective deliberation that can last from a few hours to several days depending on the complexity of the matter. The offences that come before a Kris range from violations of the Mariam system, actions that contaminate the community's ritual purity, to economic disputes, to questions of marriage obligations, to accusations of serious wrongdoing against community members. The penalties that a Kris can impose include formal apology, financial compensation, temporary social exclusion, and in serious cases a form of permanent exclusion from the community, that is, in the context of Roma social life, a genuinely severe punishment. Being excluded from your compania means losing your mutual support network, your economic connections, your social standing, and your identity as a functioning member of the community simultaneously. It is not a penalty most people accept without attempting to comply with the Kris's requirements to avoid it. The legitimacy of the Kris rests on consent and reputation rather than coercive power. The Kris has no police force, no jail, no physical means of compelling compliance. Its authority derives from the community's collective willingness to enforce its decisions through social mechanisms. The withdrawal of cooperation, the refusal of social contact, the communication of the Kris's judgment through community networks. A person who defies a Kris decision faces not official punishment, but the practical reality that their community will not trade with them, will not invite them to celebrations, will not provide the mutual aid that community membership provides. For most people, that is sufficient motivation. The Kris also functions as a mechanism for managing conflict in ways that preserve community cohesion rather than destroying it. External legal systems, in the experience of Roma communities, have historically been more likely to persecute Roma than to protect them, more likely to be weaponized against Roma by hostile outsiders than to adjudicate Roma disputes fairly. Bringing community conflicts to external courts meant exposing the community to outside scrutiny, potentially facing laws that criminalized Roma practices, and placing the outcome in the hands of people who had neither knowledge of nor particular interest in Roma welfare. Handling disputes internally through the CRIS kept the conflict within the community's own framework, allowed for outcomes that took into account the full context of relationships and obligations, and produced resolutions that the community would actually enforce. This is not to romanticize the CRIS as a perfectly just institution. It operated within a patriarchal social structure that gave senior men more authority than women, that sometimes resolved disputes in ways that reflected the interests of the powerful within the community rather than the interests of justice, and that could be used to enforce conservative social norms in ways that individuals, particularly women and younger people, experienced as oppressive. The CRIS was, and is, a human institution with human limitations, but it was also a genuine mechanism of self-governance that functioned effectively for centuries in conditions where external governance was hostile rather than helpful, and its existence as a functioning institution of community justice is worth acknowledging. The existence of all these internal structures, the Compania, the Marimé system, the CRIS, the marriage negotiations, the occupational specializations, constitutes what might be called invisible governance, a complete system of social organization that is invisible to external observers because it operates without the external markers of governance that modern states recognize. No parliament, no president, no official legal code, no police force, no flag flying over a building, and yet, disputes resolved, community boundaries maintained, culture transmitted, mutual aid provided, economic cooperation organized, and social life managed across multiple generations. The governance happened. It just happened in ways that don't show up in the administrative records that states keep. The relationship between this invisible internal world and the very visible external world of anti-Roma discrimination is one of the central dynamics of Roma history and contemporary life. The internal social structures described in this chapter were not created in response to persecution. Exactly. Their roots are in South Asian social organization that predates the Roma migration, but they were refined and strengthened by the experience of persecution. Communities that cannot rely on external institutions for justice develop internal justice mechanisms. Communities that face economic exclusion develop internal economic networks. Communities that are subjected to cultural erasure develop stronger cultural transmission practices. The external pressure, in a dynamic that persecutors never seem to anticipate, often produces precisely the internal cohesion that makes the community more resilient rather than less. This dynamic is important to understand for what it means in contemporary contexts. When European governments observe Roma communities maintaining separate social systems, resolving disputes internally, practicing endogamy, and sustaining cultural practices that differ from those of surrounding society, and then describe this as evidence that Roma don't want to integrate, they are reading the output of a specific historical process and attributing it to cultural preference without engaging with the history that produced it. The preference for internal social management is real. The history that produced that preference is also real. The two cannot be meaningfully separated. The contemporary world has added new dimensions to this dynamic in ways that the Roma communities navigating them are processing in real time. Migration within the European Union, which allows Roma citizens of Romania and Bulgaria to move freely to wealthier European countries, has created large Roma communities in Western European cities that were not prepared for them institutionally, politically, or culturally. These communities face housing insecurity, employment discrimination, police targeting, and periodic expulsion orders in France, Italy, and elsewhere that are legally questionable under European human rights law and politically popular with electorates that have absorbed centuries of anti-Roma prejudice without particular encouragement to examine it. At the same time, a Roma civil society has developed over the past several decades with a sophistication and reach that would have been difficult to imagine in earlier periods. The European Roma Rights Centre, founded in Budapest in 1996, has brought successful litigation against governments that discriminate against Roma in housing, education, and criminal justice. The International Romani Union, which first convened in London in 1971, established the Roma flag, the green and blue banner with a red wheel, the chakra that connects the community symbolically to its Indian origins and practically to the road, and the anthem O Roma anthem, and has advocated for Roma recognition as a non-territorial nation at the United Nations and in European institutions. The decade of Roma inclusion, running from 2005 to 2015, and involving 12 European governments plus the World Bank and various international institutions, was an ambitious attempt to make measurable progress on Roma integration across multiple sectors simultaneously: education, employment, housing, and health. The results were, charitably speaking, mixed. Some indicators improved in some countries during the decade, others did not improve or got worse. The gap between commitments and outcomes that characterized the decade reflected both the genuine difficulty of addressing entrenched structural inequality and the limited political will of governments whose electoral coalitions did not include significant Roma constituencies. Promising Roma integration, while simultaneously allowing or enabling anti-Roma discrimination, is a balancing act that several European governments have performed with notable consistency, which is impressive in its own way. The cultural dimension of contemporary Roma life offers a somewhat more encouraging picture, partly because cultural production is less dependent on government goodwill than housing or employment. The global reach of Roma music has expanded dramatically in the past several decades, carried partly by world music distribution channels that made Taraf de Haiduks, the extraordinary Romanian Roma fiddling ensemble that became internationally famous in the 1990s, available to audiences who had never encountered Roma music before and responded to it with the enthusiasm it deserves. Flamenco has never been more internationally recognized as a high art form, even as its Roma roots are sometimes downplayed in commercial presentations, aimed at tourist audiences who want spectacle without the complicated historical context. Tony Gatliff, the French-Algerian director of Romani heritage, has spent his career making films about Roma life and Roma music that reach international audiences without condescending to their subjects or flattening their complexity into marketable exoticism. His films, Lachodrom, Gadjodilo, Vengo, Kokoro, are among the most honest representations of Roma culture and history available in cinematic form, and their existence is evidence of a broader cultural confidence, a willingness to represent Roma life to outside audiences on Roma terms, rather than on the terms of the curiosity or the anxiety that outside audiences bring to the subject. The Roma flag, that green and blue banner with the red chakra wheel at its centre, deserves a final moment of attention because of what it represents conceptually. The green band represents the natural world, the earth and forest that Roma communities have travelled through. The blue band represents the sky, the space through which travel occurs. The red wheel, the chakra, sits at the intersection of earth and sky, ground and movement, origin and destination. It is the wheel of a wagon, yes, but it is also the wheel of time and the wheel of Dharma, the same symbol that appears on the Indian national flag, the visual echo of an origin that is acknowledged rather than forgotten, a flag without a country, a people without a territory, an identity built not on the possession of land but on the practice of movement, on the transmission of memory, on the maintenance of a language and a social framework that has travelled the entire world and arrived, still recognisable in the present. The chakra on the Roma flag is not a wheel going nowhere. It is a wheel that has gone everywhere and is still turning. The story of Roma history is not ultimately a story of victimhood, though the victimhood is real and documented and deserves honest acknowledgement. It is a story of survival, not passive survival, not mere biological continuity, but active, creative, culturally generative survival that has produced music that changed the world, a language that connects people across a continent, a system of social organisation that functioned for 1,000 years without a state, and a way of understanding identity that does not depend on geography. It is a story about what a people can do when the usual supports are absent, and the usual protections are unavailable, and the road is the only homeland they have. And so they kept moving. They are still moving, from Rajasthan to Persia to Byzantium to the Balkans to Vienna and Paris and Seville and Rio de Janeiro and Chicago and Sydney, through every empire that tried to contain them and every law that tried to erase them, carrying their language and their music and their way of being in the world, arriving wherever they arrived as themselves, leaving traces wherever they went that the places they passed through have never entirely lost. That is what 1,000 years of Odyssey looks like from the inside. Not a tragedy, not a triumph, but a continuous act of becoming, carried forward by people whose name means simply human. Good night, wherever you're watching from. Sleep well. Before arriving at that ending, though, the contemporary picture deserves more specificity. because the gap between the Roma civil rights movement's ambitions and the daily reality of Roma communities across Europe is wide enough that describing only the cultural renaissance without accounting for the ongoing difficulties would be a significant omission. Slovakia and Hungary have implemented school segregation systems that place Roma children in separate classrooms or separate schools on the grounds of learning difficulties that are, in practice, assessed in ways that correlate almost perfectly with Roma ethnicity rather than with actual cognitive ability. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled against both countries for violations of the right to education and the prohibition of discrimination. Both countries have continued practices that the court ruled against, paid the relatively modest fines that European human rights enforcement mechanisms can impose, and continued. The enforcement gap in European human rights law, the distance between a ruling and actual compliance, is a problem across many contexts, but it is particularly pronounced for Roma communities, which have the least political leverage to push for implementation. In France, the periodic destruction of Roma encampments and the expulsion of their residents, sometimes across national borders, which raises specific questions under EU freedom of movement law, have been carried out by governments of both the left and the right, which suggests that anti-Roma policy in France is not a partisan issue so much as a consistent baseline that shifts only in the intensity of its implementation. The legal challenges to these expulsions have been partially successful and largely insufficient. Courts have ruled specific operations illegal, governments have conducted the next operation anyway, and the communities that were expelled have generally returned to approximately the same circumstances, because the fundamental problem, extreme poverty, lack of stable housing, limited access to legitimate economic opportunity, was not addressed by the expulsion and is not going to resolve itself. Italy, under several governments, has conducted registration operations targeting Roma communities that critics and human rights organisations described as ethnic censuses, collecting data specifically on Roma individuals, including children, on the basis of ethnicity rather than any specific legal violation. The operations were framed as public safety measures and generated significant political support alongside significant legal and ethical criticism. The pattern is consistent with what was described in Chapter 8 as the transformation of Roma from pilgrims to permanent criminals in the European imagination, a transformation that has not been reversed in practical terms, despite the formal commitments to non-discrimination that European governments regularly make in international contexts. Ukraine's Roma communities, concentrated particularly in the Transcarpathian region bordering Hungary and Slovakia, faced a wave of attacks from ultranationalist groups in 2018 that killed at least one person and displaced entire communities. The attacks, which involved groups of young men raiding Roma settlements, burning property, and physically assaulting residents, occurred in a country that was at the time the subject of significant international attention and support due to the political crisis that had been ongoing since 2014, which perhaps explains why the violence against Roma attracted relatively little international response. The Ukrainian police response to the attacks was criticised by human rights organisations as inadequate, with some officers reportedly observing ongoing attacks without intervening. The Roma communities affected received minimal official support for rebuilding. These are not ancient history. They happened in the lifetime of most people watching this. They are the contemporary expression of a pattern that this entire story has traced. The identification of Roma communities as legitimate targets for official or tolerated unofficial violence, the withdrawal of legal protection that applies to other members of the same societies, and the political calculation that defending Roma communities will cost more votes than it gains. The calculation has been consistently correct across European democracies for decades, which says something about the electorates making those calculations that is worth sitting with. The activism that has developed in response to these conditions is real and has achieved real things. The European Roma Rights Centre's litigation work has established legal precedents that benefit Roma communities across Europe, even where compliance is incomplete. Romani language has been granted minority language status in several European countries, which provides at least a formal recognition of cultural legitimacy. Roma studies programs have been established at universities in Hungary, Slovakia and other countries, creating an academic infrastructure for Roma scholarship that simply did not exist a generation ago. Roma journalists, artists, academics, and activists operate publicly and loudly in ways that would have been considerably more dangerous in earlier decades. The Roma flag flies at international gatherings and has been adopted by Roma communities in the Americas and elsewhere as a unifying symbol precisely because it is not tied to any specific territory. You cannot make a Roma person stateless by taking away the Roma flag, because the flag was never attached to a state. The chakra wheel turns regardless of what any government decides about the people whose banner it appears on. That is, in the long view of Roma history, exactly how it should work. The journey that began in Rajasthan or Punjab more than 1,000 years ago has produced over its course extraordinary musicians, innovative craftspeople, resilient communities, a language of startling beauty and complexity, and a way of understanding human identity that may be more relevant in a world of increasing mobility and decreasing territorial certainty than the settled, nation-state framework that European history has mostly assumed. A people without a country is not by definition a people without a future. It may in fact be exactly the opposite,